going to start the recording. We are good to go. I don't think I need to share my slides because you guys on the Zoom can see that. Just again, one more time, Zoom, you're all good. You can hear me, you can see me, you can see the slides. Okay, thank you for that. Done. I have you guys, if you guys need to speak, I have the sound working. So our last class, it's we're gonna hop in and do just basically the same thing that we did last time for the midterm review. I'll just, same deal. I'll spoon feed you everything you need to know for the exam. Remember, as I talked to a couple of you guys who were here in person before the class started, but there are 2 exams that are left. So it's not just the final exam, there's the final exam and the department assessment. They're both gonna open up at the same time. First and most importantly, please make sure you take both tests. You need to take all tests in this class in order to pass, right? So you could get 3 100s and not take that 4th exam and you'll fail. I haven't had to do that to anybody and I really don't want to do that to anybody, right? So just be on top of it. If anything comes up, let me know. I recommend trying to run that practice test before you start the exam, just to make sure that you have no problems on the actual exam. Probably not a bad idea. I'm gonna send out a bunch of reminder emails. So like you've kind of already seen that through the semester. I just have them scheduled to send, so you guys are gonna get a bunch of reminder emails that this is open, that it's, it's open until whatever time. It's gonna be, remember, it's 6 p.m. It's not midnight, right? I've kind of explained to you guys why I do that. I need to be awake in case you guys have issues on the exam, whatever. So don't wait until 11:59. It's not midnight. And just generally speaking, right, the exam, we have 2 exams. It's the final exam, which we're going to review for today. This is just the second half of the class. The final exam is going to be the big exam. It's going to be structured just like the midterm. It's going to be like 50, 52, 55 questions, something like that. You'll have about, I think a little over an hour to do it. And it'll be structured basically just the same way as the midterm. To those of you who didn't do well or feel like you didn't do as well as you would have hoped on the midterm, again, students typically do better on the final exam than they do on the midterm. So, go in just confident, right? I was just chatting with some of you guys about just being confident when you walk in and trusting yourself, right? The hard work happens before you go into the exam. So that's the final exam. And then there's the department assessment, which is the full course, but that is going to be an open book test. And, I'm not saying don't stress about it. I would still study for it. It's the full course. It's more material, but it's worth 15% versus 30%, and it's open book instead of closed book, right? So I would study it for it. I think that's all the housekeeping stuff I have. Does anybody have questions on any of that? No? The makeup of the exam? Okay. All right, I'm around if anybody wants to meet for office hours, talk through any of this, and I'll do the mushy stuff at the end when you guys are all exhausted. But really, this is it's more fun than my day job. So I hope you guys have sort of enjoyed this course as much as you could have. All right. The mistake that I've made doing this many times is that I take too many questions while I do the review, and then we all end up here all night. So I'm gonna do my best to just keep trucking through. If there's anything where you guys are like really, really confused, I'm not gonna shoot down your questions, but I'm gonna do my best to try to control it. I'll also pause on the stuff that I feel like is the more confusing stuff to see if you guys have questions about any of that. But look, this second half of the course, what did we focus on? We focused on contracts, right? That's basically what this whole second half of the course was. We talked about what is a contract. We talked about those ingredients of the contract. We talked about different kinds of special contracts that exist, insurance contracts, how to be discharged, right? But that all started here on chapter 13. And we sunk a lot of time into this lecture, right? Because I told you chapter 13 is really the foundation for a lot of this second half. Right, so what was the first thing that we learned? It was that a contract is a promise or a set of promises for breach of which the law gives a remedy or the performance of which the law recognizes a duty. I mean, this is a long it's a legally enforceable contract. It's a legally enforceable promise, right? Like I'll honestly probably update this definition. A contract is just a legally enforceable promise. That's all it is, and that's the foundation, right? We talked about how not all promises are contracts, but all contracts are promises, right? And then here are those ingredients that I told you guys. If you know nothing else, and hopefully you don't know nothing else, right? But if you know nothing else, if you study nothing else, you know this is going to be on the exam, right? Because this is the foundation. This is the foundation for all of the rules that we learn. You know, this is the starting point. We talked about certain, we're going to review certain rules that apply to each of these things, but these are the ingredients of a contract, right? First, we have the agreement. That's the offer and the acceptance, right? We'll review what makes a valid offer, what makes a valid acceptance. But once you have offer and acceptance, you have a contract, right? Well, maybe, I guess, right? Because that's not enough. You still need consideration, right? We talked about how this is the difference between, hey, you know, I promised to take you to lunch. Okay, that sounds good, right? We have offer, we have acceptance. Yes, that sounds nice, but we don't have any consideration, right? That's different than I promise to take you to lunch if you watch my dog, right? Now we have that consideration, and I'm going to give you guys definitions, but remember consideration, I described it as a pinky promise, two pinkies, right? You want to think about what each side is offering. Where's the pinky coming from on each side? It's a quid pro quo, it's something for something, each side needs to give something up, right? And then there's capacity, right? You need to be able to understand what you're getting into, right? Understand the bargain that you're binding yourself to, right? So maybe you do have an agreement and maybe you do have consideration, you know, I'll take you to lunch if you watch my dog. Okay, that sounds great. But if you're talking to a 3-year-old, it's not gonna work, right? A 3-year-old doesn't have contractual capacity. And then, of course, you could have all of these things, but if you don't have a legal objective, I'll pay you $1 million to whack that guy. That is, you know, you could have all the other ingredients, offer, acceptance, consideration, but if there's an illegal contract, I mean, think about it, the law is not going to enforce an illegal contract, right? So we're gonna take these one by one, and we're gonna flush them out, okay? What is an agreement? Well, an agreement is made up of the offer and the acceptance, right? And maybe you just want to write that down instead of all of this, right? Agreement equals offer plus acceptance, okay? Remember that this ORE thing, right? This came up over and over, and I told you guys that it might feel frustrating that there's all this vocabulary, but like, if you think about it, like half the vocabulary is the same thing over and over, right? It's the person who's doing the thing and the person who's receiving the thing. Promisor, the promisee, the offeror, the offeree, right? So the offeror is the party making the offer. The offeree is the party to whom the offer is made. The offerer makes the offer, the offeree receives the offer. Together, the offer and the acceptance are called the agreement, okay? Just a quick pause, which I should have said up front. But I just want to remind you guys that this is all recorded, right? So like my best suggestion of how to study for this, like follow me as much as you can as we go. If you like can't stand to hear my voice for another second and you need to like peek down at your phone for a little bit, it's cool, I'm not gonna get upset, whatever. Tune me out, tune me back in, be respectful about it, but you know, and then I would come back and watch this lecture at your own pace, on your own time, pause, fast forward, right? Do whatever you gotta do to, this lecture is your best resource, right? So that's my advice to you. Okay, so we just talked about that first ingredient, right? So going back to where we just were, we were talking about the ingredients of a contract, agreement, consideration, legal capacity, and you know, legal objective, right? We're now talking about consideration. Consideration is quid pro quo, right? We've all heard that term on the news in politics, right? When they're talking about somebody got a bribe, it was a quid pro quo. They took money to do something, right? Well, let's zoom out, right? If you take money to do something, right? We got two pinkies right there, right? You take money and do something, right? They give money, you give something. You give services, they give money, right? And the pinky promise thing is silly. I don't know how much it resonates with you all, but I think it's helpful because you want to think about what is each party offering? What is each party giving to the table, right? So consideration is a bargain for legal exchange, right? The reason I'm doing this is because you offered to do that. And it's what I'm getting in exchange for my performance, right? What is contractual capacity? The legal ability to enter into a binding agreement. It's understanding what I'm doing. Okay, who has capacity? People 18 and up, for the most part, right? If you are experiencing schizophrenic delusions, you probably don't have capacity, right? If you are tripping on acid, you probably don't have capacity, right? But otherwise, you probably do. Okay, and you know, intoxication. I mean, you don't need to know more than what's on these slides, but in real life, intoxication is a pretty high bar, right? Like just because you had a couple of drinks, you're probably not getting that contract. But you know, if you're vomiting on yourself and a car salesman comes up and sells you a new, you know, Ford F-150, you know, it's them. We talked about the objective theory of contracts, right? This was way in the beginning, but you guys remember talking about that case, Lucy versus Sever? And remember, nobody needs to know the name of cases, right? But the purpose of cases, when I bring them up, are just to display these rules. You guys remember we talked about that, and I'm just going to repeat, you don't need to know the case that I'm talking about. Okay, what you need to know is here, the objective theory of contracts is. Okay, but remember we talked about the case that demonstrates this, where the two people are at a bar and they're talking about selling a farm, and you know, one guy in his head is like, oh, I'm gonna get this other guy, and you know, I'm gonna pull one over on him, but they actually, you know, yeah, I guess I'll buy your farm, right? But they actually take out a napkin, and on a napkin they draw up a contract. I will buy your farm, you know, on June 5th for $100,000, signed John Smith and, you know, Jack, I can't think of the last name, right? But that's to a person watching that interaction. Once you take out a napkin and you write down a contract on it, it doesn't matter what you were thinking in your head, right? That's what this rule is. Whether or not there has been an offer and acceptance, it doesn't matter. It was just a prank, right? Doesn't matter. Because if it seems to somebody who was watching like it wasn't a prank, right? I mean, then you got yourself an offer and you got yourself acceptance, right? So the objective theory of contracts tells us we base the existence of a contract on the party's outward manifestations of intent. I'm trying to read from back there today. When I go here, the light hits me in the eyes. What do outward manifestations of intent mean? It means how we behave, right? How my body language is, how I speak, like the behavior that I demonstrate that shows that I actually intend to do something, right? So we're focused on my outward manifestations of intent and how a reasonable person watching that would understand, right? What is in your head doesn't matter. We don't care about what's in your head. And that's what this is all about. Good on this, the objective theory of contracts. Talked about the difference between a bilateral contract and a unilateral contract. Okay, remember a bilateral contract is a, you know, promise for a promise, right? It's, I will wash your car if you buy me lunch. I will do your legal work if you do my accounting, right? Neither of us are necessarily doing those things. And when the accountant asks me to do their legal work, they don't expect me to sit down right now and draft a will, right? I'm promising for future performance. When you have a bilateral contract, you're not seeking immediate performance, you're seeking a promise, okay? And as soon as those promises are exchanged, as soon as we both make a promise, assuming all of the other ingredients are there, consideration, legal capacity, legal purpose, now we have a binding agreement, right? And contract law gives me, okay? That's the bilateral. But if you compare that to the unilateral contract, remember the bilateral contract was, I'll do your legal fees. Will you do my legal fee? Will you draft a will for me if I do your accounting, right? We're exchanging promises. The unilateral contract, the classic example is the rewards poster, right? Lost cat, okay? If I tell you, I promise I'm gonna try to find your cat, there's no binding agreements between us because you're not seeking me to, you know, promise you that I'm gonna try, right? You didn't say, I'll pay you $100 if you promise to find my cat. You put up a sign that says lost cat, $500 reward, and if you show up with the cat, then you're paid, right? So the bilateral contract is a promise for a promise. I'm pointing at the slides back there. Bilateral contract is a promise for a promise, and a unilateral contract is performance in exchange for a promise, right? Promise plus a requested action. And you're looking for somebody to actually do something. That's a promise. Difference between an express contract and an implied contract, right? So we're still up here in chapter 13 on the foundation. The express contract is what most of us think about when we think about contracts. You know, I promise to do your legal fees. If I promise to draft a will for you, if you do my accounting, right? That's an example. I trust in the state's attorney. That's not what I do. Not making that promise, but still, right? It's an express, explicit promise. Whereas an implied contract is you just showing up at Supercuts, sitting in the chair, letting the guy back your head, right? It's, you know, anything like that. Maybe the terms are not expressly spoken, but the contract is formed from the parties' conduct, by the way that they interact with them, right? Their conduct makes very clear that they intend to have a binding agreement. And that's the difference between these things. So we talked about three different things, okay? And of these three, let's start with the easier, right? We all remember the difference between a void contract and a voidable contract. A void contract was never a contract to begin with. It's a promise to wax something, right? It's a contract to wax something. No matter how much you want to enforce it, no matter how much I want to enforce it, the law will not enforce it. Okay, that's a void. A void contract is never a contract. It was either illegal from the beginning, or there was some issue with the contract that it just can't be a contract, right? Usually the contract is illegal, something, right? Compare that to a voidable contract. And a voidable contract can be enforced, right? It can be enforced at the option of the party usually who was wrong, right? What do I mean by that? Okay, if fraud, right? We talked about fraud, and we'll get there later. But fraud makes a voidable contract. Why? Well, because if somebody puts a gun to your head and says, "Hey, buy my Lamborghini right now for $10," right? Maybe there was a gun to your head when you said yes, but that's a great deal, right? Why should he get to say, "Oh, I put a gun to his head, so I shouldn't be held up to what I said I'm going to do," right? The person who gets to say that is the person who had the gun to their head, right? So that's an extreme example, but the voidable contract offers the party who was in some way wronged the ability to undo the contract, usually the other person. Okay, and when we talk about quasi, these are things we talked about, and we'll talk about a little later, but things like promissory estoppel, where maybe you don't have an exact contract, but maybe you don't have all of the ingredients of a contract, but it feels unfair to not give some kind of legal, right? So it's not an actual contract, but the courts might impose some kind of obligation on the parties as if a contract existed in order to stop injustice. Okay, what do I mean by this? The example that I gave is the house builder shows up, okay, and the house builder builds your house, but you know, for whatever reason, he thought you were 18 and you were really 15. Right? There was some kind of issue that made the contract not a good contract, but it doesn't feel fair to let you keep the house and him to take nothing. Right? So maybe we're not going to honor the original contract, but we're going to give him the value of, you know, the money that he spent. We'll get restitution, right? So we're going to come back to this idea of quasi contracts. And if it doesn't make sense now, hopefully it will later. And if it doesn't, then just, you know, scribble a little note down and I'll come back to it in a little. I'll explain it to you. Okay. Okay, so that's it. That's chapter 13. Okay, that's not it as far as our final review, but that's it as far as chapter 13, right? That was the foundation. Okay, so from chapter 13, when we talked about what all of those ingredients are, We kept it, we sunk a lot of time into that. We went on and we talked about those individual rules, the individual ingredients and the individual rules that apply. Right, so chapter 14 was about the agreement, right? What is the agreement? It's that first ingredient of the contract, and it is an offer plus acceptance. And you have offer, you have acceptance, you have an agreement, right? Well, what are the elements of a valid offer? Well, the offeror, right? The person making the offer needs to communicate that offer to the offeree, the person who is receiving the offer, right? Hey, I'll sell you my car. Well, if I write it on a piece of paper and stick it in my pocket, right, I've made no offer. The offeror must manifest a serious intent to be bound. Okay, what is this? This is just the objective theory of contract, isn't it? It's just saying, hey, it needs to look to the outside person as if you really want to enter into a contractual agreement, right? And the offer must contain reasonably definite terms. What do I mean by that? You can't have a contract to buy some stuff, right? I'll pay you $100 for some stuff, right? I'll pay you some money for your home, right? It's not an offer, right? So you need all of these things. You need to tell the offeree that, hey, I have an offer for you. It has to really look like you're serious. And the terms need to be able, the important stuff need to be there, right? What's an option contract? We kind of talked about this, right? And, this is the ability to keep, we did talk about this. This is the ability to keep an offer open for a specified period of time, right? So typically, if I just say, hey, I'll keep this offer open for you until Friday, right? Hey, I'll sell you my hydrophones, right? $30. And this offer is good for you until Thursday, right? Next Thursday, right? Or let's not use goods, right? Let's use services. It'll be easy. I'll paint your house for $100, and you can let me know anytime before next Thursday, right? Typically, you can't hold me to that unless we form an option. How do we form an option contract? Well, you need new consideration, right? You give new consideration in exchange for holding the offer for a specified period. And if you do that, then you can actually hold me to my promise to keep the offer open and going. Okay, here's an easy way to think about this. Think about the underlying contract and the option as almost like two different contracts, right? They both require consideration, right? I will wash your car for $30. I want to think about it. Okay, you want to think about it. Give me $5 and you can let me know anytime before next Thursday, right? You need a new pinky for that option. And we understand this? We said no. Okay, all right, that's what an option contract is. Okay, it's you give consideration in exchange for holding an offer open for a specified period of time, and that makes the offer actually irrevocable for that period. Then go back. Search by service. We talked about revocation. What is revocation? It's revoking your offer, right? This is the option or the opposite of an option contract, right? Kind of. It's taking back the offer, right? And the offeror usually, unless there's been an option, right? Because an option says that, hey, hang on, you can't approve it, right? I paid good money for you to not revoke your offer, right? But if you don't have an option contract, then you can revoke it anytime, right? So if I tell you, I will paint your house for $50. You say, hey, let me think about it, right? I can tell you, never mind. And you can't say, oh, wait, yes, I want to do it, right? That's no good, right? I can revoke my offer at any time before acceptance, and revocation is effective as soon as it's given to the offeror. As soon as I tell you, hey, I don't want to stand by my offer anymore, now that offer is dead, right? I took it out back and I shot it. There's no more offer. Rejection. We're talking about ways to kill an offer, right? Well, one way is by revoking. Take the offer back. I don't want to do that. We just talked about revocation, but there's also rejection. Right? If you tell me no, I'll paint your house for $50. No, thanks. Right? If you come back and say, hey, I changed my mind, well, that doesn't matter because the offer's down. Right? So once you have rejected an offer, you've taken that offer out back and you've shot it. Right? Doesn't matter, the offer's down. It's another way to terminate the offer, and this one is done by the offeree. Right? The offeror can revoke, the offeree can reject. What's a counteroffer? Well, a counteroffer is another way to shoot it, right? It's another way to just take the offer and end it. There's no more offer, right? What do I mean by this? I will paint your house for $100. How about 80? Right? No, thanks. Okay, sounds good. 100, right? No, well, you killed my original offer. It doesn't work that way. Once you made a counteroffer, the original offer is dead. Right? What your counteroffer is, it's just a new offer. Right? So a counteroffer is an offer made by an offeree to his offeror. Right? That's a lot of vocab, but remember what those things mean. It's me telling you, hey, let's get into this deal. You say, no, how about that deal? Right? Now what you do, you made a new offer. Right? It's the offeree becoming the offeror, essentially. And it's substituting a new bargain for the old, right? I mean, it's yes, but, right? If you guys even want to write that down, a counter offer is yes, but, right? Or how about, right? And those things are not acceptances. They're counter offers and they kill the original offer. A counter offer terminates the original. Okay? This mirror image rule is a rule, but it basically just states this. It just states this principle, right? If we have an offer and acceptance, they have to be the mirror image of each other, at least for purposes of this class. There are times when that's not true and doesn't matter for purposes of this class. If you take business law too, maybe you'll learn about it. It's for purposes of this class, it needs to be the exact same, right? So think about what does it mean for something to be a mirror, right? It's the exact same thing. What is a mirror offer? Mirror image of an offer? I will paint your house for $100. Okay, I will pay you $100 to paint my house, right? Completely the same thing. It's not, I'll give you 80, right? That's not a mirror image. And if you violate the mirror image rule, you created a counter, right? So we're still talking about ways that an offer can be killed. An offer can be terminated, right? How else can an offer be terminated? Well, it is destroyed, right? If I'm gonna sell you a Rolls Royce, and then somebody, breaks into my dealership, my car dealership, and sets it on fire overnight, right? There's no more Rolls Royce to sell, right? The offer's dead, right? Similarly, if the government for some reason made Rolls Royces illegal, well, now the offer is also, right? If the subject matter of the contract is destroyed or becomes illegal, now the offer is dead, right? The offer immediately terminates. There's no more offer. How else can an offer terminate? How else can we kill an offer? Well, if too much time expires, right? And generally, this rule is that it'll open for a reasonable amount of time. But if it's been a week, we can't come back to me and say, yeah, I'll accept that. Right? If it's been 10 minutes, if it's been 20 minutes, if it's been an hour, okay, maybe. Right? If it's been 6 hours, maybe, right? If it's been a week, probably not. Right? It's open for a reasonable period of time, and once that reasonable period of time has expired, the offer is dead. Authorized means of acceptance. Okay, what does this mean? It means that if I tell you, I will sell you my Rolls Royce for 100 grand, but you can only accept this offer by certified mail. If you call me and say, yes, sounds good, even if that otherwise seems like an acceptance, it's not an acceptance, right? Because my offer was limited to a certain means of acceptance. The only way that you can accept this offer is by certified mail, right? If the offer says that the acceptance must be communicated by a specific mode, that mode is the only means for accepting the offer. And if no means is specified, if the offer doesn't say, hey, you have to accept one way or another, well, then any reasonable means is okay. Email, text message, phone call, right? That's usually what it's gonna be, but sometimes you might have something that says certified mail only. Okay, what I'm about to say, you don't need to know. But like law cases, judges talk about, the offeror is the master of his offer, right? If I'm making an offer, I can make that offer, within the law, basically however I want to, right? And if I want to specify a certain type of acceptance, then I can do that, right? Certified mail only, that's perfectly acceptable. And it's enforceable, right? I've limited my offer in that way. I'm the master of my offer. For a unilateral contract, we talked about this, right? The only way to accept a unilateral contract is by actually performing. Right? Why is this? Well, that's because of that rule that we, I guess not a rule, it's that definition that we gave before. Right? What am I seeking with the unilateral contract? I'm seeking performance. I'm not seeking a promise. So if I have a unilateral contract, lost cat, and you say, I promise I will find your cat, we do not have an agreement, right? If I have a lost cat flyer up and you come knock on my door and you say, hey man, I don't have that cat yet, but I promise I'm gonna find it, right? You can't sue me if I pay that money to somebody else because they found my cat first. That's not how it works, right? What I'm seeking is not your promise. What I'm seeking is your performance. And therefore, the only time that there's been acceptance is when there has been performance. Once you show up with the cat, then you've accepted my offer, right? And let's zoom out from the lost cat thing. The other classic example is, I'll pay you $100 to walk the Brooklyn Bridge, right? If you walk halfway across and then turn around and go home, you can't ask me for any money. You didn't accept my offer. You changed your mind. It was too far, it was deeper, right? You didn't do it, right? I don't have to pay you, right? That's chapter 14. So that's the agreement, it's offer. Kind of talk about acceptance also. Remember, agreement is offer and acceptance, right? We're going to move on into chapter 15 now. Okay? What is consideration? Right? Consideration is actually for you guys in the business world, I feel like this is probably something that a lot of business people actually don't know. It's a legal rule that people don't know. It's actually really important. You guys should think about when entering into agreements in the world. Hey, I want to make this an enforceable agreement. Let me make sure that we're each giving consideration. Let me make sure that we're each giving something up here, right? So consideration is what somebody gets in exchange for performance, right? What is each party giving? It's these pinkies, it's a quid pro quo, it's a trade, it's something for something, right? That's what consideration is. And the reason that this says legal entity and not a person, by the way, is because it could be a corporation, right? Businesses can enter into contracts, right? So it's what Publix gets in exchange for selling tomatoes. So, right? What Farmer John gets in exchange for selling tomatoes to Publix, right? Consideration, right? There are different kinds of consideration. We talked about this, right? It's not just doing something for you. It could also be a detriment to me, right? If I promise to stop drinking for a year, right? That's got nothing to do with you, right? But you can't come into court and say, hey, there was no consideration, because there was. I put out a pinky. And the pinky that I put out was I didn't do something that I have the legal right to do, right? That's a legal detriment. So a benefit to the promisee is clear, right? I can do something for you. I can wash your car or pay you money, right? That's consideration. But I also could, you know, not get up and walk away, right? I could not eat a sandwich. You could pay me $100 to not eat a sandwich, right? And you don't have to eat that sandwich for it to be an important, that's consideration, right? I have the legal right to eat this sandwich, and for some reason you want to stop me, right? That's a detriment, right? And remember, distinguish, notice how we're distinguishing between performance and the promise here, right? The performance is either, you know, doing something or not doing something. And then you can also have a promise to do something or a promise to not do something, right? I'm not eating a sandwich, I promise to not drink for a year. Those are both, that's both consideration. Right, we understand this idea of legal detriment is consideration, yeah? Trying to pause on the sort of complicated stuff. Okay. Adequacy of consideration, we talked about this, okay? The general rule here, and it's not what you're gonna be tested on, but maybe it's helpful to know, and maybe you just wanna scribble it down, right? The court is not concerned. Oh, I guess it does say it there. The court doesn't care if you got a good deal, right? That's what this is all about. The court is not concerned because it would be exhausting. It would be exhausting for the courts to sit around and try to determine, you know, hey, is this really a good deal that this person got himself into? Maybe we should get him out of it, right? That's not the law. The law's not gonna protect you from making bad purchases, right? So typically, I paid too much money for that car is not a legal defense to undo the contract, right? If you buy a Honda Civic for $80,000, you're probably just a sucker, right? Like that's what it is. You can't go to court and say, hey, I want to undo it, right? But there are some exceptions, really just one exception. And that's if something smells funny, right? If there's indications that somebody was taken advantage of, remember we talked about undue influence, right? That little old lady, you convinced the little old lady to sign over her house, right? If there are red flags, maybe now we're gonna think about, oh, well, something smells fishy and the little old lady sold her house for $20,000, right? That feels weird, right? That's really gonna be the only time that a court is gonna look to whether a person got a good deal, and it's really just to combine it with this other thing, right? Did somebody get taken advantage of? Yeah, but this is the general rule, is that the court is not gonna be concerned with, did you get a good deal or not? And another thing that sometimes trips students up, we're okay on this? Yeah, Zoom, good. Okay, what is an illusory promise? An illusory promise is not a promise, right? It's just, I promise to pay you if I feel like it, right? What did I actually promise you? I promised you nothing, right? I promised to pay you for your shoes, you know, if I feel like it, right? It's not an actual contract, right? An illusory promise is not consideration, right? And I like the example I gave better than this one, right? It's just, I'll pay you if I feel like it, right? Because that's the clearest example of an illusory promise, right? I didn't actually make you any promise. Like, forget about even writing these words. I'll pay you if I feel like it, right? It's not, what consideration, this is all, right? It's not consideration. What consideration did I give, right? You're promising to give me something, right? I promised to sell you my skis, okay, pinky. I'll pay you if I feel like it. What I give you, right? I didn't put out anything. I give nothing, right? In order to enforce a contract, both parties must have consideration. And this is expressly stating what we've said 100 times already, right? This is the rule that consideration is a required ingredient for a contract. That's all this is, right? So the court's not going to enforce a contract that only has one pinky, right? And that's not something that I would ever say in court, because the judge would look at me like I have 3 heads, right? What are you talking about, right? One pinky, right? But like it's the court, you need to have consideration on both sides, right? That's what this is about, right? Don't ever use the pinky example outside of this class, because people will have no idea what what you're talking about. I made it up and I've never heard anyone else use it before. Okay. Good. All right. Okay, the pre-existing legal duty. Okay, I'm gonna remind you guys of the case that I gave you about this, and remember, you don't need to know this, right? But before I do that, we're talking about consideration. What is consideration? What constitutes a pinky, right? What constitutes that quid pro quo, me actually being willing to do something for you, us giving that something for something? What doesn't constitute consideration is a pre-existing legal duty, right? If I've already promised to do something, promising to do it again is not consideration, because I already had to do that, right? So what's the example that I gave? It's the classic case in law school. You guys don't need to know the name of this case. You don't need to know anything about this case. Okay, but if you guys remember, I talked about the Alaska fish packers case, okay? In this case, you have a bunch of fishermen who promise to go, again, I just want to keep repeating this. You don't need to know anything I'm talking about for purpose of the example. You need to know this, okay? But we're explaining, right? This case, you have a bunch of fishermen who go up to the waters of Alaska. They go from sunshiny Florida, Miami to Alaska. And they promise that they're gonna fish the waters for $500 a day for a week. They get to Alaska and they're like, man, this sucks, right? It is cold here. The weather sucks. The water's choppy. We should have asked for at least 1,000, right? They look at their, commander, the fishing commander. Yo, Bill, right? Hop on the phone with the company and tell them we need 1,000, right? Bill could say, all right, we'll deal with it after. Okay, right? So we have offer and we have acceptance, and that's actually what happened in this case, right? The company is just like, whatever, fish the waters, we'll deal with it after, right? And then they come back and they're like, hey, we're here for our money, and he gives them 500 apiece. They say, no, you said 1,000. He said, that's not an enforceable promise. By the time that I said 1,000, we had already agreed to 500, right? So what is this all about? Those fishermen already had a duty to fish that water, right? That's this rule. If you've already promised to do something, you already promised to fish those waters for $500, you can't say, now I want 1,000, right? That's, you don't need to know the case, but that's this rule, okay? What do you need to do? Hey, we'll stay here longer, right? We'll do more work, we'll work faster. You need to offer to do something different than what you've already promised to do, right? That's not pre-existing duty, right? That's new. But if all you're offering is something that you've already agreed to do, that is not consideration. You're not really giving a pinky at all, right? You're not offering anything. Okay, everybody good on this? Yeah? Awesome. Okay, Zoom, I'm assuming we're good, yeah? Okay. Okay, the difference between a still chapter 15, yeah. Difference between a liquidated debt and an unliquidated debt. This is just vocabulary, I'm sorry, you gotta know it. But it's not super complicated, right? A liquidated debt, I owe you $500, right? We both agree that I owe you $500. That's period, right? We both know exactly how much is owed, right? That's clear. An unliquidated debt, there's some kind of good faith disagreement about how much is owed, right? I think that I should only have to pay you $300 because there was some kind of issue with performance, right? I was supposed to pay you $100 for every window that you built, but you built 3 of them well and you built 2 of them poorly. So I'm only willing to give you $300, but you really think you're entitled to $500, right? The window example is a weird example, but you get it, right? We have a disagreement about the amount of money that is owed. Or maybe we have a disagreement about whether money is owed at all, okay? Why are we talking about this in the chapter about consideration, right? We're talking about this in the chapter of consideration, chapter about consideration, because of this concept, accord and satisfaction, okay? If we have a good faith dispute about the amount of money that is owed, right? I think that I owe you 300. You think I owe you 500. We can shake hands right now and call it 400. And that's an accord satisfaction. The consideration that we both gave is we agreed that we were gonna meet in the middle. We agreed that we were gonna, that we were gonna come to a compromise. We were each gonna stop digging our heels in, right? So that's what you need to know here, okay? What you need to know for purposes of the exam is the difference between a liquidated and an unliquidated debt. A liquidated debt, there's no dispute that money is owed and we know exactly how much is owed. An unliquidated debt, there's some kind of dispute about whether money is owed at all or how much money is owed. And accord and satisfaction is only possible with an unliquidated debt. What is accord and satisfaction? It's agreeing to meet somewhere in the middle, right? It's almost like a settlement. Right, we're good, we understand what an unliquidated debt is, we understand liquidated, accord and satisfaction, and also one of the more complicated things, I think. There you go. Here's what accord and satisfaction is, here are the actual elements, okay, and we just talked about it, so I'm not gonna go, super long on this slide, but it's settling to pay an unliquidated debt. Remember, you can only have this with an unliquidated debt. What does it mean for the debt to be unliquidated? It means that there's some kind of dispute about how much is owed. So now there's a dispute over how much is owed. The debt is unliquidated. The creditor, who's the creditor? It's the person who's owed money, right? We talked about that in the bankruptcy chapter. The creditor agrees to accept as full payment less than it thinks that it's owed, right? I'll take 300 even though I feel like you owe me 5, and the debtor pays that amount. And now the debt is gone, right? We've reached an agreement. You have to think about this in the context of consideration, and maybe this is helpful, maybe it's confusing, right? You don't have to know what I'm about to say really, but if you think about what this is, right? Your pinky is that you have agreed to stop claiming what you feel is the full amount. My pinky is that I've agreed to pay what is more than what I think I owe, right? And we've met somewhere in the middle. We've each offered something, and that's what the accord and satisfaction is. We've come to an agreement, right? We agree to put it to bed. We agree that we're both done with this. And the consideration that we both give is you agree to take less than you think you're owed. I agree to give more than I think I have to pay, right? If that's not helpful, tune it all out. What we need to know are these ingredients, right? Debt needs to be unliquidated. Creditor agrees to less than it thinks it's owed, and the debtor pays the amount of money that they've agreed on. Okay, what is capacity? We're on chapter 16 now. Any burning questions on any of the stuff that we've covered so far? It's okay. Yeah. What is capacity? It's knowing what you're doing, right? It's the third required element. Remember, we're going through those contractual elements one at a time right now. What's the first one? It's the agreement, offer, and acceptance. The second one is consideration, which we were just talking about. Now we're talking about capacity, right? What is capacity? It's that third ingredient right before we get to legal purpose, which is the fourth one. And it's knowing what you're doing. It's having the mental ability to understand your rights and obligations under a contract. And therefore, you're able to fulfill them, right? We're not going to hold a 2-year-old to their promises, right? Even if there's consideration, even if there's valid offer and acceptance, right? You have to know what you're getting yourself into. You have to be able to understand that. What is emancipation? Well, let's think about why we're talking about this in the context of chapter 16 when we're talking about capacity. Who does not have capacity? Minors don't have capacity, right? If you're under 18, you don't have contractual capacity unless you've been emancipated, right? And this is like is this a Britney Spears thing or maybe like an Amanda Bynes thing? This was like one of those documentaries. This is a big thing that like child stars do sometimes, like so that they can have legal rights to enter into contracts without needing their mom and dad, right? It's like, there's definitely controversy about it. And I think this was on that like documentary, Silent Quiet on Set, whatever, the big new Netflix one, anyway. Nobody needs to know anything that I'm talking about yet. But the point is that emancipation, when a child has been emancipated, they have the ability to enter into contracts, right? It's the law affording upon them the ability to contract, right? So usually if you're under 18, you can't enter into contracts unless you've been emancipated. How do you get emancipated? Well, your parents or legal guardian can just completely give up your right to exercise control. And you know, if like a 17-year-old moves out, if a 16-year-old moves out, maybe they have the right to petition. You have to ask a court to be emancipated, right? But that's all this is. The general rule: if you're under 18, you don't have capacity. Remember, we're in the capacity chapter. Under 18, no capacity, unless the exception, you've been emancipated. What is disaffirmance, right? Well, before I read this, disaffirmance is essentially the minor exercising their right of voidability, right? It's the minor exercising their right to undo a voidable contract, right? Disaffirmance is the minor who has entered into a voidable contract. Said, never mind, I don't want to do that anymore. I'm disaffirming it. What does it mean to disaffirm something? It means I said I wanted it, but I don't anymore, right? I'm disaffirming. I'm not sticking to that promise, right? Because their contracts are voidable, minors have the right until a reasonable time after reaching the age 18, the age of majority, to disaffirm or avoid their contract, right? But remember, who has the right to undo a voidable contract? Well, it's the party who's being protected by the law, right? So the 60-year-old man who entered into a contract to sell a car to the 17-year-old, the 16-year-old, he doesn't get to undo it, right? The kid gets to undo it. So just the same, only the minor has the right to disaffirm the contract, right? And then just remember that it must be done within, you know, they have until a reasonable time after reaching age 18, right? So if they are 18 in a week, 18 in 2 weeks, they probably could call up and say, hey, I don't want to do that thing anymore, right? I don't want to buy those shoes anymore, right? But if it's, you know, a year after you turn 18, that's no good, right? Reasonable time then. Good on this concept of disaffirmance. Right. What is ratification? Ratification is the opposite of disaffirmance, okay? What does this word mean? Just before we dive into this. The amendments to the United States Constitution were ratified, right? Have any of us heard that word? You ratify the amendments to the, maybe I'm just a nerd and I'm picking not a great example, right? But like to ratify something means that you're like taking it on, you're fully taking it on as a responsibility, right? So if disaffirmance is saying, hey, I made this promise that I don't want to honor anymore, ratification is saying, hey, I made this promise at a time that it was voidable. I made this promise that I don't have to stick to because I'm a minor, or I was a minor when I entered into it, but actually I do want it, right? Okay, what's an example? 17-year-old leases a car from the Ford dealership, right? Honda Civic, that's what we went with. 17-year-old leases a Honda Civic for $450 a month. Okay, because that's a reasonable price, I guess, right? 17-year-old turns 18, right? So he's paying that for a couple of months. He's driving his car. It's all good. He turns 18, and he picks up the phone, and he says, "Hey, Honda dealership, I know I was 17 when I entered into this contract, but I actually want to keep this car. So I am ratified. I'm expressly ratified. I've turned 18, I'm now old enough, and I'm picking up the phone and saying, yes, I want to stay in this deal that I've already accepted, right? That's express ratification. But there's also implied ratification. Okay, what is implied ratification? It's taking action that is inconsistent with wanting to undo the contract. So if that 17-year-old turns 18 and they keep driving the car, right, until they're 19, They keep paying the lease, they keep driving the car, and then at 19, they call up the dealership and they say, hey, I entered into this contract when I was 17. I know I've had the car for a year and a half, but I don't want to do this. I don't want it for the full lease period. I don't want to keep this car for 3 years. Take it back, right? Well, his behavior has said something else, right? His behavior has, without saying words, the behavior has said, yes, I'm going to stick to this contract, right? So let's put this all in perspective, right? The 17-year-old who enters into the lease for $450 a month, they pay the lease for 3 months, they turn 18. What are their options, right? As soon as they turn 18, they can pick up the phone and call the dealership and say, never mind. And they have the right to do that. They've disaffirmed the contract, right? They've exercised their right to undo the voidable contract. Hey, I turned 18, I'm disaffirming my promise. I don't want it anymore. It's good. Or they could turn 18 and they could pick up the phone and say, hey, Honda, I actually like this car a lot. I'm keeping it. That's express ratification. Or they could just keep driving it, and that's implied ratification, right? That's ratification by behavior. Okay, that's what this is all about. It's what are the minors' options, right, when they've entered into a voidable contract. Okay, we're still talking about capacity. Okay, who doesn't have capacity? Well, mentally incapacitated people, right? People who are mentally ill, right? If you are having grandiose delusions, if you think that God is speaking to you, if you think that you're the Messiah and the only possible way to save the world is to rent this Honda Civic for a 3-year lease, right? That's like, you're not gonna be helped with that, right? That's you had a screws, right? You were not right, right? If you enter into a contract with somebody with limited mental capacity, right? It can be valid, voidable, or void, right? And really.
Professor,
Yeah,
is it possible to put the PowerPoint in presentation view?
I can't, it doesn't let me, but what I can do
Oh.
is zoom in a little bit. Is that better for you?
All right, yes, thank you.
I'm sorry, if I put it in presentation view, it messes all I haven't figured out, I'm not good enough with computers.
All righty, no problem, thanks.
If there are any slides at all that you didn't like properly see, I'm very happy to go back to them at the end of class.
Oh, no, that's fine, just this one.
Thank you for speaking up.
All righty.
And, hopefully if it's an issue with the recording, you guys can let me know. Hopefully it won't be. Also, you guys can, whatever, anyway, you can hear what I'm talking about. Mental incapacitation, right? If you're mentally incapacitated when you enter into a contract, I'm gonna read all of this, okay? We'll talk about this, but really the question is, did you know what you were doing at the time? Right? Because even somebody who has schizophrenia, okay, there are times when they're kind of with it, right? Somebody who has Alzheimer's, there are times when they're kind of with it. That's all this is, right? If you have some kind of delusions, right, but you can still understand what's going on, the contract is valid. But if your delusions are so large that you don't understand what's happening, it's voidable, right? That's all this is. It's voidable if you don't understand, it's valid if you do. Right? That's what all of this text is. It's voidable if you don't understand, it's valid if you do. Voidable if you don't understand, valid if you do. What if you're intoxicated? Right? We're still talking about capacity. Well, same thing, right? It's gonna be, if you don't know what's going on, right? It's gonna be, if contracts, if you don't know what's going on, it's gonna be voidable. Right? Contracts by intoxicated persons are generally voidable if the other person had reason to know. Right? I mean, if you're holding, and think of like, you want there to be some degree of fault, right? Like in order to, like, this voidability rule, right? Like it's not really gonna apply if you didn't appear to be intoxicated at all. I didn't do anything wrong, but if you're vomiting on your shirt and I sell you a Honda Civic for $450, right? As you're stumbling out of the bar, like we're gonna give you the right to undo it. Right? And then, just like the minor, when the intoxicated person becomes sober, they can ratify it, right? They can ratify it or disaffirm it. They could call up and say, hey, I don't want to do that anymore. Or they could say, I actually do want to do it, right? And if you're disaffirming the contract, you gotta give back the car. That's all this is, right? You gotta give back whatever benefit you got under the contract. Right? I'm just gonna take an opportunity to remind you all big picture stuff as you're studying, right? Like just before you start worrying about the rule about intoxicated persons, know what capacity is generally, know what consideration is generally, know the objective theory of contract, know these, because we're going through 94 slides here, and all of them have a lot of information on it, and just I can imagine myself being in that seat and being very overwhelmed as a college student. And I just want to remind you guys, A, I'm here to help you, but B, big picture. Don't get bogged down in the things that are, everything here could be tested, but don't get bogged down in the things that are smaller than the other stuff, right? That's what I've been saying this whole class. Okay, so is this the next one? Sorry, so I think 16 was both capacity and legality, right? So now we're talking about legality. We just talked about capacity. Now we're talking about legality. Okay, what does that mean? Is the contract legal or not legal? Okay, what is not legal? A contract to commit a crime or to commit a tort, right? What is a tort? We talked about that last semester, right? Or last half of this class. A tort is to injure somebody in some way, steal from them, right? To hurt their business, right? You can't have a contract to punch someone in the face. You can't have a contract to steal from somebody, right? You can't have an illegal contract. And what if you do? Well, then the contract is not voidable. The contract is void, right? It doesn't matter who wants to enforce the contract, right? The contract is void if it's an illegal contract. What if the contract is unconscionable? Okay, and I'll take just another minute to explain this one because I explained it, but it's a word that's going to be unfamiliar to us, okay? I think I always explain this and explained it in this class as it's super messed up, right? It's just super messed up. Something about this contract is super messed up, okay? If the contract is so unfair that it's void of conscience, right? What does that mean? It's super messed up. Then it might be unenforceable, right? It might be you don't do it, right? This requires two things. It needs to be procedurally unconscionable and substantively unconscionable. And I'm going to explain that in 1 second. I just want to make sure it's not on the next slide. It's not. What are the difference between these two things? Do we remember way in the first half of this class when we talked about the difference between substance and procedure, right? The difference between how things are done, procedure, and the actual rules of things, like the actual substance of, you can't drive drunk, right? Substance. The government needs to bring you to court within 24 hours of being arrested. Procedure, right? You see how those things are different, right? Substance and procedure. Procedural unconscionability, right? Something about the way we entered into this contract is super messed up. Maybe it's a fair contract. The substance of the contract is fair, but the procedure is super messed up, okay? What is this? I'm a lawyer, right? Clearly, we all know I'm a lawyer, right? I'm also, for purposes of this example, the slimy Honda Civic salesperson, right? And I'm a lawyer and I'm the Honda Civic salesperson and I drop documents in front of you and I say, here you go, but I don't have a lot of time. I need you to hurry up and sign it, sign here, here, and here. And you start trying to read it. And I say, man, we don't have time for that. We gotta go, just hurry up, sign it, let's go, right? I'm a lawyer, you're not a lawyer. You don't know what's going on, right? Maybe you do a little more than other people because you took this class, but that's super messed up, right? Even if it's a Honda Civic for $450 instead of $80,000, right? The procedure, the way we entered into it was wrong, right? What is substantive unconscionability? This is the $80,000 Honda Civic, right? The actual terms of the contract are wrong, okay? You need both, at least for purposes of this class. You need. Good. All right, what is legal assent? This is what chapter 17 is all about, okay? Assent is all about, and you don't need to know what I'm about to explain, but this chapter, courts describe assent as a meeting of the minds. And I hope maybe you guys remember me talking about that, okay? What does it mean to have a meeting of the minds? You don't need to know that phrase. A meeting of the minds means that we actually agreed on what we thought we agreed, right? So we're gonna talk in this chapter about mistake, right? What's the classic example of this? I will sell you a Picasso. Really, it's a Joe Schmo, right? We both thought it was a Picasso. Really, it's a Joe Schmo. We both thought it was a Joe Schmo. Really, it's a Picasso. We both thought this property was 9 acres. Really, it's 10, right? We had an agreement, but we didn't actually agree to what we thought we agreed to. That's this concept of legal assent, right? And you need assent to have a contract, right? In order to have assent, or in order to have a legally enforceable promise, a contract, you need legal assent, right? If there's no assent, the contract might be voidable. Why? Because we didn't agree to what we thought, right? And this bottom here is just the definition of what a voidable contract is, right? Voidable contract can be undone, allowing the person who has been wronged to undo the contract, and obviously, they have to give back the money, right? They have to give back whatever they got. They don't get to undo the contract and keep the $100 that they say, hey, I'm gonna undo the contract, but I'm still gonna keep your money that you paid me for the Joe Schmo, right? That's not it. Okay, so if there's no legal assent, there's no contract. And now we're gonna talk about rules that apply. Really, these are defenses to contract formation, right? These are defenses. And they're defenses that are saying, hey, there was no assent, right? We're talking about different kinds of defenses that are telling the court and the judge and the jury, hey, we didn't agree to what we thought we agreed to, okay? The first one of these is a unilateral mistake, right? It's about a material fact. Remember the difference between a material fact and an immaterial fact, right? It's the difference between how fast the grass grows at a residential house, right? It's something that doesn't really matter. And, whether there's mold in the roof, right? Like whether this is a Picasso or whether it was painted at 4 a.m, right? Those two facts are completely different, right? A material fact is one that is we both relied on in entering into this contract. It's important, right? And unilateral mistake is usually not going to be a basis to undo the contract, usually, right? Why? Because courts don't, same rule as before when we talked about adequacy of consideration, right? Courts don't want to get involved with, you're just a bad deal maker, right? You're just not good at business, right? Court's not going to save you, okay? But there is an exception that we'll talk about in just a second, I think. The exception is if you take advantage of somebody, right? If you know that somebody has made a mistake and you keep going anyway, now you have a problem, right? But if only one person has an incorrect understanding, if only one person messed up, usually it's not voidable, right? That's what you need to know for purposes of the exam. I won't use that one. The exception is the one that I just explained a minute, but for purposes of the exam, usually a unilateral contract is not. Again, the exception is if you take advantage of somebody, right? Like, hey, if the person walks in and says, hey, how much is this Picasso? And it's a Joe Schmo and you don't say anything, right? You're a jerk, you got it, right? So anyway, mutual mistake. Usually mutual mistake is going to render the contract void, right? It's a basis for rescission. What does that mean? It's a basis for rescission. It means it's voidable. Either of us can choose to undo it, right? To exercise our right of rescission, right? It's a word that you should know is rescission. If we both messed up, right? We thought this property was 9 acres, but really it's 10. and we priced it as if it was 9 acres, well, you know, you would have asked for more money if it was 10, so you can undo it, right? We both had a mistake about a central part of our agreement. And remember, it has to be a material fact, okay? This is the property was really 10 acres, but I thought it was 9, right? This is not, I thought it would be, you know, I thought the grass would be a little bit greener in the spring, right? That's not a material, right? If both parties are mistaken about a current or past material fact, either can choose to rescind the contract. What does this mean? It means the contract is voidable at the election of either party. Why? Because they both got, right? Not necessarily due to anyone's fault, but they both should be protected, right? And rescission is fair because any agreement was an illusion. Ambiguity prevented a true meeting of the minds. You see how I used those words before, meeting of the minds? What does that mean? There wasn't a real agreement. Any agreement was not what we thought we agreed to. It was an illusion, right? There was no meeting of the minds. That's the difference between you. So in sum, the difference between unilateral and mutual mistake. Unilateral mistake is usually not enough. If you messed up, too bad, usually. But if we both messed up, the contract is going to be voidable at the election of either of us. And that's the sum of both of these last two slides. Good to keep moving. Misrepresentation. I don't love this distinction, but there's an innocent misrepresentation, right? If there's an innocent misrepresentation, it's, you know, there's been a false statement, but I made the false statement by accident, basically. I really truly thought that this was a Picasso when I told you it was a Picasso, right? There's a negligent misrepresentation, right? The guy who sold me this told me it was a Picasso, but he sold it to me for 15 bucks out of the back of a truck, right? I had every reason to believe it wasn't actually a Picasso, but still I told you it was a Picasso and sold it to you for $100, right? It's a negligent misrepresentation, right? It's a situation where I made a statement of material fact that I thought was true. But if I had just looked into it a little bit, I would have known it wasn't true, right? I had reason to believe that it wasn't true and I didn't look into it. So the difference here in innocent misrepresentation is I made the statement believing it to be true, right? And the negligent misrepresentation is I made the statement of material facts thinking it was true, but really I could have known it wasn't true had I looked at it, right? If there's been a misrepresentation, usually you can undo the contract, right? It makes the contract voidable at the election of the person who has been misled, right? And what is a fraudulent misrepresentation? It's making a misrepresentation with the intent of misleading somebody, right? I told you it was a Picasso because I wanted to mislead you because I wanted to bring you up, right? So a fraudulent misrepresentation and misrepresentation. Remember, we're still talking about assent, right? That's what this is all about, the meeting of the minds. Well, if I lied to you, there was no meeting of the minds, right? It's a contractual defense, misrepresentation. We're still talking about contractual defenses. We still remember when we did this. I'm just gonna flash forward for 1 second. We talked about these defenses as if they existed in a bucket, right? And the bucket was assent, right? There was no assent, and that's all the defenses that we're talking about. Right, and all of these things that we're talking about, there was a mistake, so we didn't actually agree on what we said we agreed on. There was a misrepresentation, so we didn't actually agree on what we said we were agreeing on. And now we're talking about undue influence, right? In a minute, we'll talk about duress, right? Put a gun to your head and say, hey, agree to this, right? There's no meeting of the minds there. We didn't actually, maybe you read literally, but you didn't actually agree, right? We didn't have the meeting. Undue influence is taking advantage of the little old lady, right? This is the little old lady who has no friends and no family and just the caretaker that is paid for with her social security money. That's the only person that she talks to. Obviously, you don't need to know this example. All she has in her life is the caretaker who says, hey, you know, what do you think about selling me this house for 10 grand, right? I know it's $1 million house, but just come on, 10 grand, you know, you can do it, right? It's wrong. It's taking advantage of somebody, right? If you have a special relationship with somebody and you're dominant to them, right? You have some degree of dominance, right? The caretaker and the little old lady, right? You take advantage of them and you interfere with their ability to make an independent decision, it's going to render the contract voidable. Right? Everything that we're talking about is going to render the contract voidable at the election of the person who has been taken advantage of. There's been undue influence. By the way, this is you don't need to know what I'm about to say, but this happens a lot in wills. This is a way that you can contest a will. Like if somebody left money to somebody, you could say, oh, there was undue influence, right? It wasn't a real bequest. It wasn't, the person didn't really leave the money, they were taken advantage of. Right? It's a way to challenge a will. You don't need to know that. You need to know it's. Okay. Duress is the classic gun to the head. It occurs when one party threatens another with some kind of wrongful act. Hey, I'm gonna kill you, I'm gonna hurt you, I'm gonna throw a Molotov cocktail at your business, I'm gonna slash your tires unless you lease this Honda Civic for $450. Right? We didn't actually have a meeting of the minds, right? So it's not assent because the coercion has interfered with that party's free will. And for the court to undo the agreement, you have to show that you had no reasonable, right? I had to accept, right? Why? Because if I didn't accept, he was gonna punch me, right? I couldn't just drive away, right? Some guy's yelling, you know, hey, unless you buy this Honda Civic, right, I'm gonna come punch you. And he's walking and you're in your car and you could just drive away, right? That's different than this, right? But, you know, gun to your head is a very different situation. Chapter 18, we're talking about statute of frauds. We're about halfway through this, so I'm just gonna keep pushing for as long as I can. Like I said, if you guys need to tune me out for a short period of time, it's all good. I recognize, believe me, on the other side of this, it's a lot for me too. You know, it's a long class. What is the statute of frauds? Okay. The statute of frauds is chapter 18. We're talking about contracts in writing. And by the way, we're getting closer to the stuff that we learned more recently. So it should hopefully this should click more easily, right? The statute of frauds are certain kinds of contracts that need to be in writing. They're intended to make contracts easier because you're able to easily prove that there was a contract. Why? Because it's in writing. It's intended to prevent people from saying, hey, he orally promised this thing. He orally promised to sell me land, right? And it's to prevent parties from entering into contracts that they don't normally actually agree to, right? What is all this saying? Statute of frauds is intended to prevent fraud. Right, we want to prevent people from saying that there was a contract when there wasn't actually a contract, right? We want to make it easier to protect certain kinds of contracts that we think are so important that they should be protected, right? I think I could edit this. Yeah, it's not licensed, and I don't know why it's like this. It's been like this the last few times that I entered in here, right? And if I were you guys on your piece of paper, right, what's the acronym, right? My legs, we remember that? MYLEGS, okay? I'll go through them in that order. You can list it. The M is marriage, contract and consideration of marriage. Remember, all of these are contracts that need to be in writing, okay? A prenup is the classic example, right? Why? Well, Jack and Jill get divorced, right? Jack and Jill have accumulated $10 million during the course of their marriage. They divorce. And Jack says, hey, I know that I don't have a piece of paper. I don't have a contract, but she promised that, orally we had a prenup, right? We're worried, right? We're worried about fraud, right? So all of these need to be in writing. Prenuptial agreement needs to be in writing, right? Marriage. Years. Why? If it cannot possibly be performed within 1 year, okay? And I think that we're going to talk about those specific rules in a bit. But remember, if it can't possibly be completed within 1 year, right? We're going to talk about that in a second. MYL, land is the next, right? Contracts for an interest in land. Buy land, sell land, lease land, whatever. Executorship and surety, you could put E and S together for purposes of this class. It's promising to pay a debt for somebody else, right? E and S are this, suretyship, paying somebody else's debt, right? If you want, for purposes of this class, you could write it as, sure, I'll pay your debt, right? That could be the S. Sure, I'll pay your debt, right? It's promising, this is co-signing somebody's credit, right? And the G is goods over $500, right? So marriage, prenuptial agreements, year, it can't be done within a year. L, land. E is executorship and suretyship, is you'll pay somebody else's debts. And G is goods over $500. My rules. I promise any of your friends in law school know that abbreviation. Okay, this is a prenup. Prenup needs to be in writing. It's an agreement that two people enter into before getting married. We know what a prenup is, right? It's common in everyday language, I think. Okay. And now we're going to start talking about some of the exceptions to the statute of frauds. Okay. Remember, before we start talking about the exceptions, this is probably what I would consider one of the smaller topics compared to some of the bigger topics, like what is the statute of frauds, right? Big picture, okay? Don't panic as you're studying. Part performance in a land sale contract is an exception to the statute of frauds, okay? I have a lease with my landlord, right? But it's not a written lease. So it violates the statute of frauds. But if I've already paid money for the property and started to live there, well, now I've done two of these three things and it's good evidence of a contract, right? So if you've paid any of the money, you've begun to live there, for one's not listed, so I guess those are the only two you need. If you've paid any portion of the money, oh yeah, permanently improved, there it is. If you've begun to permanently improve the land, you build some kind of fence around it, right? Why? Because these are the kinds of things that only somebody who actually, like, we're not worried about fraud because this is pretty good evidence that you actually have a contract, right? If you buy a piece of property, even if it's done orally, if you start living there and building fences around it and paying for it, right? That's good evidence that we have a contract, right? So the three things, and I'd write here if I could for you, but it's 1, paying money, 2, improving the property, and 3, taking possession of the property, right? 1, paying money for it, any portion of the money. 2, improving it, building a fence. And 3, taking possession, you actually live. If you have those 3, usually it's 2 out of 3. But if you have that, then it doesn't matter if you don't have a right. Statute of frauds, it's an exception. Okay. So we're talking about the statute of frauds. The statute of frauds requires us to have a signed writing. Well, what does the writing have to say? Right? That's what this is talking about. These are the kind of things that need to be in the contract, the writing, right? What needs to be there, the names of the parties, right? Who agreed to this? Who's agreeing to this contract, right? we hereby agree to sell some things for some money. That's not enforcement, right? You need the names of the parties, the subject matter, what's being sold, is it land, is it property, is it a car, the consideration, right? And other relevant terms, right? And that's really, it's gonna be these three are gonna be the big ones. And then we also talked about how it needs only to be signed by the party against whom enforcement is sought. Who is this? This is usually the defendant. Okay, why? Just as a matter of principle, why is this true? Well, remember, the statute of frauds is intended to prevent fraud, right? So if I'm the plaintiff, who is the plaintiff? It's the person suing, right? We're not worried about whether my signature is there because by virtue of signing, I'm agreeing that that contract existed, right? Who needs to have signed it? The defendant, the person I'm suing, so that he can't say or she can't say, no, I never agreed. Right? And if they have a signature, they clearly agree. Now, the parole evidence rule on the exam, one of the things that I think is for sure one of the more difficult things that you guys learned in this class, okay? So again, be patient, right? Just study the other things before you start worrying about the parole evidence, okay? What is the parole evidence? I explained this as the respect the written contract, right? You have a written contract. Therefore, oral agreements made at the same time or before are irrelevant. Okay, I'm going to read this in a second, but I'm just going to give you my definition again. Okay, if there's a written agreement, oral agreements that were made at the same time or before are irrelevant. If the rule applies, we'll talk about what the rule applies in a second. Okay, what does this mean? This means that $450 lease for the Honda Civic, you can't say, hey, he promised to throw in Super Bowl tickets with that. Why? Because we have a contract, right? That's not in the contract, right? The parole evidence rule is a rule that says that oral evidence of an agreement made before or at the same time as the written agreement is irrelevant, inadmissible. As long as the parties intended to have the written agreement be a complete and final version of the agreement, right? This means that the contract includes everything that you would think it includes, right? So what's something that is not the complete and final version of an agreement? It's the contract for the Honda Civic, but $450 for a Honda Civic of a color that will be determined later to be delivered at a time that is determined later, right? All of the terms of the contract are not there. It's not a complete final version, right? What is a complete final version of the contract? I will sell you a Honda Civic for $450 a month for a term of 18 months with money paid on the first of the month. The Honda Civic will be red, right? It's got all the terms that it needs to, right? So it's not a complete agreement if it doesn't say how long the lease is, right? Like the length of the lease to be determined later, right? Then the rule is not going to apply. But if it's a complete and final version of the contract, then we're going to respect the contract. There's a writing, we're going to respect the written contract, right? But we're going to do that by preventing you from saying anything that contradicts what the written contract is. I'm going to take questions on this in just a second. I'm going to finish explaining it first. Okay? This rule, remember I said a minute ago, the parole evidence rule is the respect the written contract. Okay? The rule says, if it applies, you can't introduce an oral promise, right? Any oral promise that I made to you at the same time or before we signed this contract doesn't matter, right? My promise to you made before the contract or at the same contract does not apply, does not matter where the rule applies. Where does the rule apply? It applies if the contract is a full and complete representation of our agreement. Okay, it has all the terms. That's what I was saying a minute ago. What is another way to say that the contract is a full and complete representation of our agreement? The contract is integrated. If the contract is integrated, it is a full and complete representation of our agreement, okay? So the parole evidence rule applies to keep out oral evidence, right, made before or at the same time as the contract, if the contract is fully integrated, right? If the contract is integrated. If the contract is a full and complete representation of our agreement, it's integrated, okay? And then how do we, so you might say, right, how do I know if a contract is fully integrated? It seems like really hard work to sit there and decide, does this contract say everything that you would think that it says? Well, if you're a good business person, if you're a good lawyer, you're gonna take all the guesswork out of it. And you're gonna put a clause in the contract. That contract is gonna say, this contract is intended to be a full and complete representation of the parties' agreement. And now nobody has to guess, right? That's what a merger clause is. A merger clause is saying this contract is integrated. Okay? A merger clause is a way to expressly say this contract is intended to be a complete and final version of our agreement. Okay? And if there's a merger clause, then we know the contract is integrated. If the contract is integrated, oral evidence that contradicts the contract is irrelevant. Okay, so in sum, what is this rule? Where a contract is fully integrated, we just learned what that means. Where a contract is fully integrated, we're going to respect the written contract. And we're not going to care about any promises that you made at the same time or before a contract. Why? Because why wasn't it in the contract? If it was after, okay, well then I guess we made it after. It makes sense that it wouldn't be in the contract, but if it was at the same time or before, right? We have a fully integrated contract, $450 a month for that Honda Civic. It's got a merger clause. We know that it's fully integrated. You can't take me to court and say, hey, you promised that if I make my payments on time every month for 6 months, he was going to give me Super Bowl tickets. Why? Because we're going to respect the written contract. And this is sort of it's very complicated, to be honest. I'll try to, does anybody have questions? I'll give it like a minute. No? Zoom's good? Okay. All right. Again, one of the more complicated things in this class. Chapter 19. I could offer you guys 5 minutes, but I sort of feel like everyone would prefer me to just keep moving. Yeah. Just tune me out if you get tired of it. For what it's worth, I would kind of like 5 minutes, but I'm gonna do this. All right. Obligors and obligees. Give me a second to try to remember what chapter 19 is. Okay. Chapter 19 is third-party rights and obligations, right? We talked about third-party beneficiaries, we talked about delegation, assignments, right? Well, in that context, in order to understand all of those things that we're about to talk about, we need to understand who is the obligor and who is the obligee. Scary vocabulary, same rule that keeps coming up, right? The obligor is the person who is obligated to do the thing. The obligee is the person who is ready to receive that obligation. The obligor pays money, the obligee receives money. The obligor washes the car. The obligee gets their car washed. The obligor cleans the house. The obligee gets their house cleaned, right? That's simple, right? So the obligor agreed to tender consideration, right? They agreed to give the pinky. The obligee agreed to receive the consideration, right? They agreed to receive the pinky. Okay. What is an assignment? This is the J.G. Wentworth example, right? Nobody needs to know the J.G. Wentworth example, but remember what is that? That's, I have a structured settlement and I need cash now, right? What is a structured settlement? You don't need to know anything that I'm talking about right now. I'm going to bring it back to this in a second. It's just an example. What is a structured settlement? A structured settlement is you have the right to You know, Publix sued me, I sued Publix, I have a $10,000 judgment. I'm gonna get $2,000 a year for, 5 years. But I don't want $2,000 a year for 5 years, I need cash now. So what do? I call JG Wentworth. And I say, hey, JG Wentworth, I'll sell you my 5-year right to receive this $10,000 over 5 years. I'll sell it to you right now for 5, right? What did I do? Okay, we're bringing it back now. What I'm talking about now is actually, you don't need to know anything I just said. I took my right to receive that money and I assigned it to JG Wentworth. I had the right to receive money and I took my right and I transferred it to a third party. I am the assignor. I'm the person who did the assignment, right? I made the assignment. JG Wentworth, who again, his name is not going to come up on the exam. The person I gave my right to is the assignee, right? It's the person who is not in privity to the contract. Remember, privity is this idea of a legal relationship that exists under a contract. The assignee is the party who had nothing to do with the contract at first, but now they've received that transfer, right? Now they've received that assignment. Okay, what's a delegation? Similar but different. Instead of transferring my right to receive something, now I'm transferring my obligation to do something. Okay? We've all heard the word delegation in a very similar context. You're an intern for someone. I have interns. I have people working for me. Not at the moment, but just bear with me for the example, right? I have too much work to handle, okay? So I take some of the work that is lower hanging fruit and I give it to my intern. I've taken my work and I've delegated to somebody else, right? We're all familiar with delegating. We've all heard that term, right? Delegation is taking my duty to do something and transferring it to a third party, right? So in the context of law, if I have an intern, the intern did not sign a contract with the client, but I can take my obligation to do certain kinds of work, right? Some research, whatever it is, right? And I can give it to the intern. And the intern can help. Now I've delegated. I've become the delegator. I've made the delegation. I've done the delegating, thus making me the OR, the delegator. And the intern has become the delegatee. I had to think about my example for a second. The intern has become the delegatee, the EE, the person who has received the delegation, right? The intern was not privy to the contract. They did not have an initial relationship to the contract, but now they've received that. And that's a delegation. Now, even though John, the lawyer, John, the 10-year lawyer, has given the work to Jack, the first-year lawyer. He's delegated that work. If Jack, the first-year lawyer, does not do the work, the client is still going to be pissed at John, right? Very pissed. And John can't say, your problem is with Jack. Take it up with Jack, right? Go get the intern. Wasn't me, right? No, because the person who did the delegation, the delegator, is still on the hook, right? Even if the delegatee did not do what they were supposed to do, the delegator is still on the hook. And this is why if you're delegating work, you should be careful about who you delegate work to, right? It should be somebody you trust to get the work done, right? This is very common, again, in contractor, subcontractor situations, right? You're building a building, but I don't know how to build every aspect of the building. So I get an asphalt guy and I get a cement guy and I get a roof guy, right? And if the roof guy doesn't build the roof, I'm getting sued, right? I'm getting sued by the people who hired me to build the building, right? Because I took the work and I delegated to others. I'm still on the hook, okay? So what we just talked about were assignments and delegations, okay? Those are two ways that a person who is not in original privity to the contract can have either rights in the case of assignment or duties in the case of delegation to a contract that they did not sign, right? That's what we were just talking about, okay? We're talking now about another way that somebody may have rights under a contract, even though they didn't sign it. And this is the third-party beneficiary. Okay, what is the classic example of the third-party beneficiary? Life insurance. Awesome job. Thank you, Roy. Life insurance is the classic example. Jack and Allstate enter into a contract, right? Where when Jack dies, Allstate is gonna, again, I don't even know if Allstate does. I should really look this up these days. Jack, I don't know if Allstate does life insurance. They do it for the purpose of this, yeah. Jack and Allstate have an example or have a life insurance contract where when Jack dies, $1 million is going to be paid to Jill. Jill had nothing to do with that contract. But when Jack dies, Jill has the right to collect that money. And if the insurance company doesn't pay out, Jill can sue the insurance company, even though she had nothing to do with that initial contract. Why? Because she was an intended beneficiary. Okay, we're gonna talk in a minute about the difference between an intended and an unintended. A third-party beneficiary is created where two people, two parties, right? It could be a business, doesn't have to be a person, entity. Created when two parties enter into a contract with the purpose of benefiting a third party. And this is the key to the intended beneficiary, right? The whole reason we entered into this contract was to benefit that third person. The beneficiary does not necessarily need to be named in the contract. And by the way, what I'm saying right now is it's sub-rule, okay? Worry about this before you worry about this. This is more important than this, okay? But this is a relatively easy rule when I give it to you, okay? The beneficiary doesn't, like, Jack doesn't need to write Jill. Jack could write my wife at the time of my death, right? As long as it's reasonably definite, as long as it's clear who the person is, they can still be a beneficiary. But it can't be some people, it can't be my friend, right? It needs to be reasonably definite, okay? And I think, so we're gonna talk in a moment about, I'm gonna come back to it, okay? Somebody remind me not to go forward and to go back, okay? I wanna compare, because I think this is the easiest point of comparison, or transition, I guess, to this. What we talked about a minute ago was the intended beneficiary. Okay, the intended beneficiary is Jill in the life estate contract. Jill has rights under that life insurance contract. Why? Because the whole reason that life insurance contract was entered into was to benefit Jill. We can all agree on that, right? That's why Jack entered into this contract, was because he wanted to make sure Jill was okay after he died. The incidental beneficiary has nothing to do with the contract, except for the fact that they just got lucky, right? They just happened to be benefited. Okay, the example that we gave in class is if your neighbor is remodeling their house, right? And it's something that is going to make your property value go way up for whatever reason. Your neighbor is building some kind of super cool spectacle, right? That everybody is really excited about. It's going to make your property increase by 10 times, right? Because they're getting it landscaped really nicely. Okay, that's the example. They're getting really nice landscaping and you're excited because your property value is going to go, right? You're just an incidental beneficiary. That contract wasn't created for your benefit. So if the landscaper doesn't show up, you don't get to sue the landscaper, right? You don't get to say, hey, landscaper, I'm suing you because I didn't get the unintended benefit of that contract, right? The incidental beneficiary has no rights, right? The incidental beneficiary is one that the contracting parties did not intend to benefit. They only unintentionally benefited the person. And that makes the third party an incidental beneficiary. An incidental beneficiary cannot sue. You got no rights as an incidental beneficiary. You understand the difference between intended and incidental? Okay. Back. Okay. Okay. Just understand that there's a difference between a creditor beneficiary and a donee beneficiary. Look, you could write this down, but just what are the difference between these words, right? Creditor and donee. You had something donated to you, or you received it in exchange for a debt, right? The donee beneficiary is Jill, right? Jill receives the money under that life insurance out of the goodness of her husband's heart, right? Her husband benefited because, or her husband intended to give her a gift, right? That's the donee beneficiary. This is different than the creditor beneficiary, where you owe me money. You owe me $100. And I say, hey, my sister really needs $100. You know, I'm gonna wash your car, but instead of paying me the money, pay it to my sister. Right? You owed me money and my sister became the creditor beneficiary. You're paying her the money instead of me. That's a creditor beneficiary. A donee beneficiary is Jill in the life estate, in the life insurance exam, right? You didn't, the life insurance company doesn't owe Jill any money. At first, they didn't owe Jack money, but because Jack donated that to her, she's now a donee beneficiary. So that's the difference between these things. Could you keep moving? Like I said, there's a lot in this class, but hopefully if you've been kind of following as we go, it's like, if you've never heard me say any of these words, you're panicking right now, right? Like for sure, but like it should hopefully mostly sound familiar. Stuff that doesn't sound familiar, come talk to me and we'll figure it out together, right? Class isn't over yet. I don't think I could teach you the whole class in a week, but if there are certain things that you want to talk through, I'm here, okay? What does it mean for rights to vest? Then I have to take a sip of water. I explained this as the Dragon Ball Z exam, right? It's like, I don't know if you guys even know what Dragon Ball Z is, but it's like a beam shooting into a person's chest where they like absorb these rights, they absorb the rights, right? That's probably a weird thing that's going to be on the recording now. The intended beneficiary, right? They have the right under that contract once their rights vest, right? So it just, again, I explained this in class, like maybe you've heard of having you don't need to know what I'm saying, but maybe you've heard of having a 401k at your job, right? And you need to work at your job for a certain amount of time to have rights to that money. Certain kinds of jobs will offer you stock ownership, where, hey, we'll give you 2% of the company, but you don't have the right to that money until you've worked here for 2 years. Once you've worked here for 2 years, then you've absorbed that right, right? Your right is vested, okay? What you need to understand is a third-party beneficiary has no rights until their rights vest, right? So they can't sue until those rights vest. And until those rights have vested, right, Jack can still change his life insurance beneficiary, right? The contract can change up until the point of vesting. All right, chapter 20, discharge. Discharge is how you're done with the contract, right? You wipe your hands clean, you move on, there's nothing else to do under the contract. So when a party's obligations under a contract is terminated, there's nothing left to do under the contract. The party is said to be discharged. Again, where else have we heard this word? What does it mean to be discharged from the hospital? What does it mean to be discharged from the army? Right? You're done with it. There's nothing else to do. So when you've been discharged of your contractual obligations, you're done with them. There's nothing left to do under the contract. Okay? How can you be discharged of your contractual obligations? There are a number of ways that we talked about in this. Okay? And I think we're going to go through them after this. Yeah. So I'm going to give you these and then we'll go through them. Okay? The first is by conditions, right? You can live in my house until you get married. Once you get married, the condition has happened, and neither of us need to do anything more under the contract. The contract is done, right? You could be discharged by performance. right? If you've done everything you said that you need to do under the contract, then there's nothing left to do in the contract. Right? You could be discharged by material breach, right? If, you know, the other side has not done what they said they were going to do, you don't have to do what you said you would, right? That's material breach. We talked about anticipatory repudiation, which we'll talk about in a minute. Mutual agreement is we just simply agree that we're not going to do what we said we were going to do. And then there's discharge by operation of law. Okay, discharge by operation of law is somebody dies, bankruptcy, impracticability, etc. Before I keep pushing through chapter 20, do you guys want to take 2-3 minutes? Yeah, okay, I think I want to. Let's give it like, it's 8:22, let's give it until 8:25, okay? All right, we're moving again, guys, 8:25. So what we were talking about in chapter 20, where I took a poorly timed break that I really should have done before starting the chapter, but we're all the way at the beginning. We're just talking about discharge right now, right? Ways that you, again, you're discharged from the hospital, you're discharged from the army, means that you don't have to do anything else, right? There's nothing left to be done. Okay, these are the ways you can be discharged. We just went through all of them: conditions, performance, breach, mutual agreement, operation of law. We just went through those a minute ago. And now we're going to break them down one by one. Okay. What is a condition? Well, there are different kinds of conditions that can cause a discharge, right? Or different kinds of conditions that I guess can be relevant to discharge, right? Condition precedent is you don't have to do anything at all until a condition happens. Okay, what does it mean for something to precede something? Okay, if you don't know the word precede, right? Precede means come before. But if you don't know the word precede, what does the prefix? What does pre mean? Pre means to come before, right? I don't know, I can't think of something right now. Preschool, okay, that's actually a thing. Preschool is before school, right? It was before you went to school, or I guess it's its own thing. Right, but a condition precedent is a condition that has to happen before you have to perform. I'll pay you $100 if the Yankees win the World Series, right? That's not a real offer, but that's a condition precedent. The party's duty to perform arises after, by the way, it could be a real offer. It's not a real offer for purposes of me making it right now. A condition precedent is the party's duty to perform arises after a particular event happens. If that event never happens, the party's duty to perform never comes up, and the parties are therefore discharged from the contract, right? So if the Yankees never win the World Series, if the year goes by, the Yankees don't win, you don't have to do anything. I don't have to pay you anything, right? I got no obligation, no duty, right? Condition subsequent. I have to perform until the subsequent event happens, right? For something to be subsequent to something else, it means it comes afterwards, okay? A condition subsequent is where the party has a duty to perform until a future event occurs that discharges the party, right? So the occurrence, when the thing happens, I don't have to do any more what I said I was going to do. Example, you pay me $10,000 now, and you can live in my house until you get married, right? That's an example. You pay me $10,000 now, you live in my house until you're 67. But if you get married at 68, I'm kicking you out, right? Because the condition happened and now I don't have to do it, right? I've been discharged. Or conditions concurrent, right? Well, we both have to perform at the same time. Cash on delivery. This is most transactions. This is meeting the guy from Craigslist at a parking lot to buy a PS4, right? He gives you the PS4, you give him the cash. Both of you have been discharged of anything further. There's nothing left to do, right? That's it. The contract is done, you've been discharged. And these are conditions. There are express conditions and there are implied conditions. Okay, an express condition is, again, if on the condition, I mean, you could write these things down, but I think they're pretty clear, right? It's expressly stated in the contract. I'll pay you money when the Yankees win the World Series. I'll pay you money, when you graduate school, right? I will stop letting you live here when you get married. That's an express condition. But there are also implied conditions. The example we gave of this is if you hire somebody to be your driver, well, then it's implied that they need to have their driver's license first. Right? That's an implied condition. It's not expressly stated in the contract, but the way the contract is written and what the contract is about makes it clear that you're not hiring somebody as a driver unless they have a legal right to drive. Right? That's an implied condition. With a contract of satisfaction, again, this is one of those things that's maybe a little confusing, and I'd also classify as probably a sub rule, right? Again, like. I'm not saying these things aren't important because they're here, and if they're here, they can be tested, and maybe this is a question, but like. If you don't know what a satisfaction contract is, you're in much better shape than if you don't know what consideration is. Right, because there's 100 rules that apply to consideration. This is one, right? So a satisfaction contract is basically you have to keep performing until I'm satisfied, right? Like basically you have not been discharged until I've been satisfied, right? So if I pay you 100 grand to paint a painting to my satisfaction, you paint a painting that I don't like, you gotta paint me a new painting. Right, it's satisfaction is considered an express condition, and it needs to be met before I have to pay. Right, so I don't have to do anything until that condition of satisfaction is right. You have subjective or objective satisfaction. Subjective satisfaction is usually going to be for something like art, right? I have to actually like it. Objective satisfaction is gonna apply for anything that is not like art or music or something that is related to your personal taste. So if it's about building a building, the objective standard is gonna apply. What is objective satisfaction? It's just, is it good enough? Would a normal person be happy? Right? Would a normal person be okay with it? Again, I think this is something that probably a few of you are confused about, and it's just because it's sort of abstract and kind of complicated. But that's, again, like, that's the whole thing, right? It's it. It's all you need to know about satisfaction contracts, right? So just understand that it's, you know, it's an express condition that needs to be met before your obligation to pay for that thing, before your obligation to perform rises, and it's either objective or subjective. And it's subjective if it's something like art, it's objective if it's something like building a building. And then this is the question that you asked a second ago. This is anticipatory repudiation. What is anticipatory repudiation? Well, I explained it a minute ago, but if you hire Beyonce to sing at your kid's birthday party for $100,000, and Beyonce, your kid's birthday party is on December 2nd, and Beyonce calls on October 1st and says, hey, I took this other gig on December 2nd for more money. Sorry, I'm not showing up. I don't have to wait until December 2nd. I could sue her right now. Why? Because I could sue her under a theory of anticipatory repudiation. Okay, so this is the words that you should know. Okay, but let's break them down. What does it mean to anticipate something? It's coming. I can feel it coming. I anticipate that it's coming. Repudiate means to not do what I said I was going to do. Right? So I anticipate your repudiation. If I anticipate your repudiation, then I can sue now and I don't have to perform. Right? Why do I still have to pay Beyonce if she's not going to do what she said she was going to do? Right? So if the breaching parties, right? If Beyonce calls me and says, hey, I'm not going to do what I said I was going to do. And she says that before she's supposed to do it, before the date of my kid's birthday party, then I don't have to pay her. I don't have to, I'm discharged of my obligation under the contract, and I'm free to sue her right now, even though she doesn't have to perform for another couple of months, right? Why? Because she's made very clear she has no intention to do so, right? So we talked a little bit, a lot of it. This is a concept that has come up a couple of times throughout this class, and it came up in the first class, in the first half of this class also. Equitable remedies. Okay, equitable remedies are different than what we call legal remedies. Okay, and I'm just saying it's not on the screen, so don't worry about what's not here. What you need to know is here. Okay, but a legal remedy is money, paying somebody money. An equitable remedy are these things, right? Rescission and restitution, you unwind the contract. And if you unwind the contract, you give people back what they got under the contract. What is restitution, right? If you've stolen from somebody, you have to make restitution, you have to give them back what you took. Well, if you're undoing the contract, you get restitution, you have to give them back whatever money you took from them, right? Not necessarily illegally, but the contract's been undone, you don't get to keep their money. There's something called specific performance, where the court can actually make you do what you said you were gonna do. It's rare, and it only happens in certain situations, which I'll teach you if they're on the next slide. And there's something called an injunction, which is that finger wag from the court, knock it off, you can't do that, right? It's the court order either forcing a person to do something, or more commonly, forcing a person to not do something. Okay, all of these are called equitable remedies, and equitable remedies are non-monetary. They're remedies that are not money, right? Why? Because giving you money is not enough, right? Giving you money is not gonna stop you from violating your non, right? That's the classic example. Okay, I know it's a long day, guys. I'm as fast as I can. Okay? We're talking about damages now. Okay, and we're getting like real close to the home stretch. This, I think, is the last chapter of like just general contracts. And we talked about chapter 20 was discharge and damages. We're talking now about the different, okay, there's been a breach of contract, right? What happens now that there's been a breach of contract? You can be compensated, right? Yeah, remember, this is compensatory damages. The goal of contracts is to put you in the position you would have been in if the contract was honored. Okay, so the example that I gave in class, and for those of you who are too tuned out, all good, you'll listen to the recording and it'll be better then, right? The example I gave in class for compensatory damages is Publix contracts to buy 500 tomatoes from Farmer John at $1 a piece for $500. Farmer John doesn't sell those tomatoes. Publix needs to go out and buy those same 500 tomatoes for $600, okay? What's the difference? It's $100. So if Publix sues Farmer John, Publix gets $100. Why? Because that's the $100 that Publix needs to give it the same position that it would have been if Farmer John had sold it the tomatoes. If Farmer John had sold it the tomatoes, then Publix would only have spent $500. So Farmer John needs to give Publix the $100 so that all Publix has to do is spend $500. They don't have to spend anything. And that's compensatory damages. They're designed to put the plaintiff is the person who sues, they're designed to put the plaintiff in the position that he or she would have been in if the contract had been performed. They only would have had to pay $500, so they don't have to pay $6. They only have to pay $5. Where they're gonna get the $100 from, they're gonna get it from the guy who breached, right? From the guy who breached the contract. There's something called nominal damages. It's a pat on the back. Take $1, take $5, have a nice life, right? You were right. The other side breached, but really you weren't actually harmed. So here's $5 and, don't come back to my corporate, bye, have a nice life, okay? Something called punitive damages, which are designed to punish the defendant. This is much more common in torts, very uncommon in contracts. And then there's something called liquidated damages, okay? What is a liquidated damage? It's where we agree upfront how much you'll have to pay me if you breach, okay? So you agree that I'm gonna pay your house, I'm gonna paint your house for $100, and if I don't paint your house, I will have to pay you $20, right? We agreed upfront that the damages would be $20, right? We specified in advance in the contract how much damages would be if there was a breach, okay? It's liquidated damages. Yeah, we're still talking about damages. This is actually sort of important for people in the business world, right? Those of you going into business, just understand that if somebody has breached the contract, you don't get to just sit around and do nothing, right? You don't get to just, you have to do your best to try to mitigate the damage. So you have to try to make it better. You have to use reasonable efforts to minimize the amount of damage resulting from breach. Okay, so if, I'm gonna give an example that you don't need to know, but this is an example that hopefully is gonna make this more clear. Okay? Farmer John is supposed to sell me those tomatoes for $500. And I'm supposed to then sell those tomatoes to somebody else for $1,000, right? Farmer John doesn't sell me the tomatoes. So now, what position would I have been in if he had sold me the tomatoes? I would have made $500, right? But I need to at least try to go out and get tomatoes from somebody else. I need to try my best so that he doesn't have to eat the whole 500, right? I have to try to make it better. That's all this is, okay? The mitigation of damages, it's a concept that if the other side has breached the contract, you have to do your best to try to minimize what the other party has to pay to you in the event of breach. Okay? I'm gonna keep pushing. Now we're in landlord-tenant law. And we're really in the home stretch here because these next 3 chapters that we're gonna cover are last months. Okay, so this all should sound really familiar. I'm telling you guys, I tried very hard to trim the fat out of this course, really just teach what you need to know for purposes of this exam, especially for the summer version of this class, which is so condensed. There are 4 types of leases. So we're talking about landlord-tenant. Okay. The first, and I'll explain them from bottom up, but I guess the tenancy at sufferance is the holdover tenant, right? It's the person who doesn't leave when they're supposed to. The tenancy at will, you could leave at any time. The landlord can cancel at any time. The periodic, let me just make sure that this isn't on the next slide. Okay, so I'm actually going to explain these a little better right here. We have 4 types of leases. Okay, let's take them from the bottom up because it'll be clearer that way. A lease for a definite term is going to be the one that we're all most familiar with. A lease for a definite term is a 1-year lease, it's a 6-month lease. We know exactly how long the lease lasts, right? I'm living here until the lease is up, and when the lease is up, I'm done, right? So a definite term is the lease that we're all most familiar with, okay? You can also have what's called a periodic lease or a period tenancy. And what is this? Month to month. Sorry about your hand. It's all recorded, so don't worry, okay? It's all recorded. If you don't get every word, all good. It's gonna be easier to come back. And I always feel bad for people who are in. I've said this many times. A period tenancy is month to month, week to week, year to year. Right? There's no fixed term. It's not a definite term. We don't know exactly how long it's going to last. But we know the intervals in which the lease renews, day to day, week to week, month to month. Okay? Tenancy at will. You live here until the landlord gets sick of you or you get sick of the landlord, and either one of you can cancel it at any time. Okay? It's at will. What does it mean to be at will? It's at when you're done with it, right? And the tenancy at sufferance is the tenant that doesn't leave when they're supposed to leave. It's the holdover tenant, right? And this just exists so that the landlord has some, the light isn't blinking. The tenancy at sufferance just exists so that the landlord has some ability to collect rent from the tenant who has stayed, right? There needs to be some kind of legal mechanism to collect rent, right? So the tenancy at sufferance is just created by law, by operation of law, when the tenant doesn't leave when they're supposed to. Okay, 4 types of leases. We're good?
Quick question, what, can either of these categories include an option to renew? So like with the rental or with your regular lease agreements that you have the option to renew each year, what kind would that be?
It's an option contract. It's a really good question, but you remember we talked about option contracts a little earlier?
Yeah, but it doesn't fall under either of these categories. That's what I want to know.
It's not its own kind of, it would be combined, right? Remember how we talked about how an option is essentially a second contract built into the new contract?
Yeah,
So
yeah.
what, you want to try to do some review? What do you need for the option contract?
Okay.
I can give you the answer if you want. You don't have to do it.
I can think about it. The
Starts
option
with the-
contract is where it's open for a specified period of time, and then the offeree has within that period of time to accept.
You're doing an incredible job. That's a
If they
fantastic
don't-
definition, but what do you have to give in order to get that, in order to get that, just gave it to you, in order to get that option? How do you get it?
Consideration. So the offeree has to give consideration to obviously have that option.
Really, really good job, but remember, it has to be new consideration, different consideration from the underlying contract.
Okay, got it.
So let's put this into perspective, okay? This is really good review that you just did. We have a 1-year lease. That 1-year lease is for $2,500 a month. For 1 year.
Mm-hmm.
That's a lease for a definite term. Pay me an extra $500 and I'll give you the option to renew. You understand? That extra $500 is new consideration.
Okay,
The consideration is $2,500 a month for 12 months.
yeah,
For the option to renew, give me $500 extra, and that's additional consideration.
okay.
Confused?
Not quite. I just have to think about it.
Okay. You did a really good job. You gave me a great definition. It's exactly what an option is, and the answer to your original question is, it's not its own kind of lease. The option contract is something you tack on to one of these leases. You give additional consideration for it.
Okay.
And really, thanks for that. That was a really good review. You did a great job. Thank you.
Thank you.
We're good. We understand what these things are. Sorry to put you on the spot. You didn't have to participate. I appreciate it.
No worries.
Okay. So we're still talking about landlord-tenant stuff, okay? We're talking about landlord-tenant law, and we're now talking about the Fair Housing Act. Okay, what is the Fair Housing Act? The landlord-tenant discrimination. Okay, that's all this is. You could sit here and you could memorize all of these things, but like, you really don't have to, right? They're the things that feel intuitive. You can't discriminate on the basis of race, religion, gender, yada, yada. Again, to be very, what's the word I'm looking for? Valid, to be.
Protected class.
Yeah, if you're a protected class, you can't discriminate against a protected class, but what I'm getting at is not even about this, it's just. For purposes of being complete and thorough, it's not entirely true that this is applicable to every lease, but for purposes of this class, it is. There are certain kinds of, at least federally, there are certain kinds of landlords that this doesn't apply to. At the state level, it probably applies to. But for purposes of this class, all you need to know is the Fair Housing Act keeps you from discriminating against a protected class. Thank you. Okay. So we're moving on from the Fair Housing Act. We're still talking about landlord-tenant law, and we're talking about the implied warranty of habitability. Okay, what is the implied warranty of habitability? It's just a promise that you could actually live. A person can live here, right? The premises are fit for human habitation. So if you have a residential lease, right? If you are living in a residential property, I mean, in what world does the lease have to say landlord hereby promises that the premises will be fit for human habitation, right? That doesn't need to be written in the lease. It's assumed, right? It's an implied promise, which is the reason why you don't have to guess if you're gonna have to, walk to a well to get running water and walk back, right? Like you can just assume that the property that you're leasing is gonna have running water. Why? Because of the implied warranty of habitability. It's a requirement that the premises be fit for ordinary residential purposes, and it's included in every residential lease. Okay, I got 20 slides left after this. What's the covenant of quiet enjoyment? Okay, it's similar. It's an implied promise. It doesn't have to be written into the lease. It's implied. Okay, the landlord doesn't have to say, I hereby promise that I'm not going to interfere with your ability to use the property. It's implied, right? So the covenant of quiet enjoyment is, what's a covenant? It's a promise, right? It's a promise that you'll get to enjoy that property quietly, right? Without the landlord, excuse me, without the landlord coming and making noise and making problems and, you know, changing the locks or whatever else, right? Landlord promises that he or she will not interfere with tenant's use and enjoyment of the property. By the way, you don't need to know what I'm about to say, but changing the locks on your tenant is like super illegal. Like if any of you guys ever own property and you've got a bad tenant, like super serious penalties for just changing the locks. It's an illegal eviction and it's not allowed. So just not something you need to know for purposes of this class, but piece of wisdom. The landlord is going to be responsible for injuries that happen in common areas, in the lobby of an apartment building. Somebody slips and falls, right? The staircase, if the stairs break and you fall through the stairs, the landlord is going to be responsible. This my mouth. Okay, let's keep moving. If the tenant moves out before the lease is over, they abandon the property. That's it, right? You might not even, what does it mean to abandon something, right? You leave, right? So if you left before the lease is up and you've got no intention to come back, you've abandoned the property. Nature of the insurance relationship. Okay, so we're on now the second to last chapter, almost there. Talking about insurance, we're talking about, so we've already gone through, guys, we've done all the rules of contracts, right? Now we're just talking about those last specialized kinds of contracts that we learned about. We just talked about landlord tenant, now we're talking about insurance, okay? Here's just some vocabulary, and you know, sorry, you need to know the vocabulary. These are just things you probably want to memorize, but they're things you probably know, right? Who's the insured party? It's the party who pays the premium. What's the premium? It's the money you pay every month, right? The insured party is the party who's paying for the insurance. The beneficiary is the person who's entitled to receive the proceeds to get the money if the insured event happens, right? So if you have car insurance and your car is damaged, right, you're the beneficiary, right? You get the money that the insurance company pays out, right? You're also probably the insured party. You're the party who's paying the premium, right? Who's the insurer? The insurer is State Farm, Geico, right? Also known as the underwriter, which is vocabulary you should know. The insurer is the insurance company, also known as the underwriter. What's the premium? Premium is the payment that you make in exchange for that insurance. What is the policy? It's a contract. Policy is just a contract, right? It's just a special kind of contract that we're talking about right now. But the insurance policy is just the contract. It's that concept of moral hazard that we talked about. You guys see, I'm really trying to teach you guys the thing, right? All of this should sound familiar, right? We talked about all of this. Moral hazard is this risk that insurance companies are really worried about, that people aren't going to be careful with their stuff because it's insured, right? So it's the fear that if somebody has car insurance, they might not lock their doors. They might park it in a dangerous area. They might drive a little faster. Why? Because the insurance company's got me, right? You insure a watch, you insure a Rolex. Maybe you're less careful about where you put the Rolex. You're less careful about the neighborhoods you walk through, right? The insurance company is very worried about this concept of moral hazard, right? It's this idea that sometimes people who are insulated from risk, they might behave differently. Okay. What else is the insurance company thinking about? The insurance company is thinking about risk management. What is risk, right? We all know what risk is. It's the potential for loss. What is risk management? It's transferring and distributing risk. Okay, the entire business of the insurance company is risk management. It's taking your specific risk and distributing it amongst 1 million people, right? So that if I have to pay you, if I, the insurance company, has to pay you $100,000, well, I have 1 million other people paying me $1,000 and okay, right? Risk management. So risk and risk management, insurance company are always thinking about these. The application for insurance, the effective date is the date that the policy becomes effective. The binder is the one-page document showing that the insurance company intends to provide insurance. It's temporary proof of insurance. A lot of vocabulary in this chapter, sorry. But what is an effective date, right? It's the date that the contract becomes effective. That's all it is. Right? The binder, I don't really know how to make easy for you guys, just the binder is temporary proof of insurance. All right, guys, almost there. 12 or 13 slides. Okay. We talked about these things, more vocabulary, sorry, but we talked about an incontestability clause, right? So remember we talked about how you have to be truthful in your insurance application, right? How that's, you made a misrepresentation. If not, you have a problem with the offer that you made. Well, the incontestability clause says that the insurance company can't contest, they can't challenge statements that you made in the application after a certain period of time, after 5 years, after 2 years, whatever, right? The anti-lapse clause exists to prevent, to protect the little guy who forgets to pay his insurance for a month, right? It's a grace period. If you forget to pay your insurance for a month, you're probably still insured. Why? Because of the anti-lapse clause, right? You have a 30-day grace period. What's the appraisal clause? If you have property that's insured, it's damaged by a hurricane, you think there's been $100,000 of damage, the insurance company thinks that there's been $30,000 worth of damage. It's a very common scenario. There's very probably a clause in your contract that says, if we disagree about the amount owed, a third-party property appraiser comes, tells us how much is owed, and we both agree that we're gonna abide by that, right? So it allows the insured party and the insurer to select a disinterested appraiser for a second opinion on damages. Arbitration clause. We talked a lot about arbitration in this class. The arbitration clause provides that disputes must be submitted to arbitration. Remember, arbitration is just alternative dispute resolution. It's instead of going to court, you go before an arbitrator, and their decision is binding. Right? Anybody need me to talk more about what arbitration is? We're good. It's in chapter 4, if anybody needs to refresh their recollection on that. And by the way, like just another tip, okay, like study tip, it's helpful. Whether this is helpful, I don't know. But like, look, if you're in class right now and I mention a certain thing and you're like, what's he talking about? And you go back and you watch the review and you're like, watching the recording and you're still like, what's he talking about? Back open your textbook, right? See if the textbook explains it any better than I did in class, right? And if you still don't get it, then shoot me an email. You also don't have to meet with me in office hours if you don't want to. I'm happy to answer questions by email too if you guys want. Different types of insurance. There's individual insurance that's purchased by the person who's insured. There's group insurance that's purchased by a whole group, right? That's not necessarily the insured or the insurer, right? Maybe this is some kind of organization, right, that buys insurance for all of its members. There's personal insurance that covers a person's life or health. There's commercial insurance, which covers a business, right? Somebody slips and falls at Publix. And then there's casualty insurance, which prevents a person, or excuse me, protects a person from accidental injury. You guys on Zoom have had no problem hearing me, right? Good. Yeah, okay, thanks. I'm not even sure where the microphone is located here. I'm not sure if it's this one or. I guess it picks me up as I continue walking around. All right, good. Liability insurance protects a business from tort liability. What is it, tort? It's, if somebody slips and falls on your premises, it's personal injury, right? What we think of as personal injury law. So you can and probably should have liability insurance if you run a business, so that if somebody hurts themselves at your business, you call the insurance company, right? There are 10 slides after this. Okay. There are different kinds of liability insurance, right? And like, again, this might feel like vocabulary, okay, but what is it? Commercial just means that it relates to business, right? I do commercial litigation, right? I do business disputes, right? So commercial liability is protection of a business, right? It's insurance that a business purchases, right? To protect their business. If somebody slips and falls, if somebody, if they have some kind of issue that forces them to shut down, maybe COVID, right? The COVID pandemic, I don't, probably is some kind of exception for global pandemic, but right, it protects a business, right? There's product liability insurance. Okay, what is product liability? You buy a toaster and it blows up, right? The toaster company probably has product liability insurance, so that if they have to recall the toaster, or if the toaster hurts somebody, they're protected if there's product liability. And then there's professional liability insurance. It's covered, that's carried by somebody like me, by a professional, by an accountant, by a lawyer, by a doctor, so that if the doctor is sued for malpractice, right, they stitched somebody up the wrong way, they accidentally operated on the wrong arm. That's something that actually happens, by the way. They left a scalpel inside somebody's body. You'd be like, all these things happen, right? They have professional liability insurance that protects them from, if they get sued, the insurance company is going to defend them. The insurance company is going to pay them. There are two primary types of life insurance. There's whole life insurance, where I can reach an agreement with the insurance company right now that for the rest of my life, I'm going to pay $5,000 a year, and that rate is not going to change, right? We talked about how whole life insurance has a cash surrender value. How if I don't want it anymore, I can call the insurance company and they have to pay me some amount of money for my life insurance. Then there's term life insurance, which is where the life insurance, like almost like that lease for a definite term, right? It's very different, but like we know exactly how long the term is, right? I'm covered by an insurance company for 5 years, right? Not for the rest of my life, but for 5 years. And when those 5 years are done, I probably need to negotiate a new policy, right? But it's a contract that lasts for a known specified term. And the beneficiary is paid only if the insured dies during that term. Bankruptcy, guys, the very last chapter. Okay, all of this should sound really familiar. We just did it at the end of last class. most of what you need to know is about chapter 7. Okay? And like, even this stuff, like, I'm not saying that bankruptcy and insurance and landlord tenant law, I'm not saying that these things are not important. I'm really not saying that. Like, I hesitate to even fully say what I'm gonna say because it's all important, right? But like, the bulk of this class has been contracts, right? And at least the second half of this class, and all that contract stuff kind of builds on itself, and, you know, consideration comes up, it comes up, it comes up. So maybe you want to get really comfortable with consideration before you start worrying about all that vocabulary in the insurance contracts that we just talked about. Right? I'm not saying, please don't take me the wrong way. I'm not saying you don't need to know those things. I'm just saying that I think this is a class where you really want to try to prioritize how you're studying. Anyway, what are the goals of bankruptcy? To provide protection to creditors, provide opportunities for debtors to get a fresh start, provide an organized method for which insolvent debtors can respond to their debts. Insolvent debtors are just people who owe more money than they have, right? You're insolvent if you owe more money than you have. So it's just to provide. Remember, it's those competing goals. We want to help the debtor, we want to protect the creditor. Those two competing goals. The 3 different types of bankruptcy that we talked about. The chapter 7 is a liquidation. Take your stuff and sell it, right? That's a chapter 7. You take the debtor's non-exempt assets. The trustee takes them. The trustee is the person that's in charge of that pool of non-exempt assets and sells them for the distribution of creditors. Chapter 11 is going to be a reorganization, right? It's usually for businesses. The business doesn't go away, but it's like, so Sears can keep operating, right? And so the idea is like, if the company keeps operating, they can pay more money over the long term than if we just shutter their doors, right? So it's reorganization of debtors' financial affairs, and it's, you know, it's the business restructure, right? The business trying to figure out how to become profitable. And then chapter 13 is what we call the wage earners plan, right? Chapter 13 is a wage earners plan. It's only for people with regular income. And I'll get back to this slide in a second. I think we're gonna, So we're gonna go through these one by one in a second. So if you don't understand it based on this slide alone, that's cool. We're gonna go through. And also this should be reviewed. So, but it sounds sort of. Bankruptcy law is federal law. We talked about that, Article 1, Section 8 makes it federal law, but it's influenced by state law, right? There are certain state law things that influence bankruptcy law, like the exemptions that we talked about. Remember, it's all recorded, so it's all good. Now back to this, you can watch it again as many times as you want. I know it's been a long class and, you know, but it's all recorded and you can come back to this. The liquidation, chapter 7, is the most familiar, I guess, right? Like it's the one we talked about the most. Sometimes it's called the straight bankruptcy. And it happens where the debtor, right? Remember the person who owes money? They take all of their possessions. They go into this big pool, right? I think you guys can see me on the video. All the possessions go into this big pool. And then those assets are sorted, right? The exempt assets, the debtor's home, the place where the debtor lives, he keeps. The debtor's Rolls Royce, debtor's yacht, right? That's going to go to the trustee. And the trustee is going to sell those things. They're going to distribute the money to the creditors, right? So liquidation, what does it mean to liquidate something? To get rid of it, sell it, right? Liquidation happens when a debtor turns over all of their non-exempt assets. Remember, they keep their exempt assets, they give their non-exempt assets to the trustee. The trustee is the person who's in charge of that pool, right? That pool of non-exempt assets. The trustee is the individual who takes over administration of the debtor's estate. What is the estate? It's all of the non-exempt assets. It's the property that the trustee is in control of. Right? You guys have questions on this, I'll come back to anything you want after we bang this out. We got 5 more slides. Okay. There usually, chapter 7 is done voluntarily. There are very rare instances where it's done involuntarily. That's all you guys need to know. It can be involuntary. Usually it's voluntary. I actually don't know how common I guess I've never seen an involuntary. Yeah, I guess it happens. Okay. Automatic stay. It's an important concept. This is again, like this gives the debtor some breathing, right? Because if you think about it, you're the debtor and you got all the blessings. You have all these people beating down your door, you owe all these people money, okay? But as soon as you file for bankruptcy, all those creditors need to step back and wait it out, right? They all need to wait the process out. Why? Because of the automatic stay. The automatic stay is this big shield that goes up to protect the debtor. As soon as the debtor files for bankruptcy, he holds up that automatic shield, right? I got a light in my eye. Holds up the automatic shield and then the creditors can't touch it, right? Until the bankruptcy is over. And if they do, there are serious penalties, right? There's you can sue creditors for messing with you during the automatic stay, right? This is the whole point of bankruptcy. It gives the debtor some time to figure things out, right? So the automatic stay, whether it's voluntary or involuntary bankruptcy, all the creditors, almost all, need to just cut it out and wait it out, right? Why? Because of the automatic stay. What is discharge, right? It's the light at the end of the tunnel for the debtor. Okay, remember what the word discharge means. We talked about it in the context of contractual performance. You don't have to do anything else, right? You don't have to do anything else under that contract. There's nothing left to do. So once the debtor goes through all of the pain of bankruptcy, right? They go through this whole process. They've had their things taken and sold. Now they don't owe any money, right? They don't owe American Express any money. They don't owe, Best Buy any money for that TV, right? Or any of those things, right? Their things have been taken, they've been sold, and they're done, right? There are certain exceptions to that, like student loans, alimony, yada, yada. But typically, you don't have to pay once you've been discharged of your debts. And the exceptions are like you can't discharge them at all, right? Like you can't discharge student loans. If the debtor has honestly dealt with the bankruptcy court during the bankruptcy, they're going to get discharged, right? And remember, if you're not honest, right, you're not getting it. You're going through all the pain and you're not getting that bankruptcy. Okay, second to last slide. A reaffirmation is where you have a debt that is otherwise dischargeable in bankruptcy, right? So I have my credit card debt and I really like my American Express card, and American Express says, if you file for bankruptcy, you can't have an American Express card ever again. But if you agree to pay this money that you otherwise wouldn't have to pay me, then I'll give you, you can have your account again, right? A reaffirmation, what does it mean to reaffirm, by the way? We learned about this in the context of, reaffirming promises that you have made, right? It means to do something that it's the opposite of disaffirming, right? It's saying that you're still gonna do something that you had to do before, right? And if the debtor wants to pay a debt, even though that debt can be discharged, they can enter into what's called a reaffirmation agreement, where the debtor agrees to pay the debt, even though it could be discharged in bankruptcy. Okay. Very last slide, and then I'm happy to stick around and go through whatever anyone wants. I'll go back to any slides. And I don't know if I was so zoomed out in the first few that people couldn't see them, so I'll just, I guess, quickly flip through the first 30 or so slides so that people could see those on the recording if they need to. Chapter 13 is wage earners plan. It's only for individuals with regular income. So it is wage earners plan. It's for people only, not for corporations, and it's for individuals with regular income. That is the end. So that's it, guys. I'm sorry for all of the information that I've jammed in your head today, but hopefully it wasn't all brand new. You know, like I said last class, this is wrapping up my first full year of teaching. So thanks for being a part of it. Really, this is super enjoyable for me. So, you know, long day, long class. I'm happy to stick around. Again, remember a couple of things. We don't have class next week. Nobody come here next week. Nobody sign on to Zoom. There's no class. The intention is you guys are going to use that time to study. You know, hopefully it's helpful. Remember, the exam is, the deadline is 6 o'clock. It's not midnight. I'm around if you guys need me. So guys, thanks. And also, I'm always around, like, if you guys have questions after this class about law school or grad school, life, you got my email address. You can always get me on LinkedIn or whatever. Thanks. If nobody needs anything, I'm just gonna really quickly look back through the first, I think, 30 or so slides, just in case you guys didn't. Round if anybody. I know it was a long day. Take it easy. Was for me though. Won't get home safe. I don't remember where I was.
Thank you. Have a good one.
It is, bro. I'm around if you need me. Have a great one. Thanks. I'm gonna email through Monday. Thanks. What's up, my friend? If it's not something you want to be recorded, give me just 1 second to finish looking through this. Well, I just want to make sure that. A pleasure, really. Thanks for showing up. And I think this is more or less what I'm trying to.
Thank you, sir.
Take it easy, bro. Have a great one. Thanks for being part of the class. Going the recording now.